Okay, I wanted you to wait to know what it feels like to be an apocalypticist and nothing actually happens. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. I have Dr. Jeffrey Tripp with us today. How are you?
Not bad, not bad.
Dr. Tripp, you were on here several other times. We've dealt with arguments on eyewitness testimony in John. You've written a book. Let me pop this sucker up for everybody. Well, we got a couple things to show them before we get into undesigned coincidences. Number one, you have a YouTube channel. And I have not hit that refresh button, but there's 324 subscribers. By the end of this episode, everybody watching this will have eternal conscious torment if we do not get past 500. Okay. I have decreed it. It is so. It's got to be eternal. It cannot be annihilation. It has to be the worst. Because I love you. You know what I mean? I love you. So make sure you subscribe. I'm being silly here. Subscribe to Dr. Tripp's YouTube channel. I hope when we refresh this at the end that we've surpassed 500. I ask all of you myth visionaries in the chat to keep reminding people, if there's any you mods in there, share Dr. Tripp's YouTube. I want to grow it because I want him to want to keep coming back and making more videos. He also has the book, Direct Internal Quotation in the Gospel of John. How would you sum up this book and what it's about?
It's about a weird literary tick of John's where he has characters say things and then he has people re-quote them. The quotations are almost never accurate. And so it's looking at what John's doing with these direct internal quotations, why he's introducing a piece of speech and then repeating it. So the literary devices he's using with that. And I get into John's use of tradition and also John's indulgence in apocalypticism and how he's modifying apocalypticism to his own ends.
Just to be honest and very fair, this is obviously an academic publication. If it wasn't, you wouldn't see such a high price. It's just the way things go. You have another publication though, Sacred Text and Sacred Figures you played a part of?
Yeah, I co-edited it. It's and I contributed a chapter on John's 153 fish, looking at the reception history of how people have interpreted that. And it's a festschrift in honor of Edmondo Lupieri, who was my dissertation director and is just a fantastic human being.
Awesome. Okay, and then also you're on academia. People can go check out your writings, some of your videos, of course, and harass you there begging for eternal heaven and bliss. They can do that. Maybe you're merciful. So, Dr. Tripp, we're talking about undesigned coincidences pertaining to an apologetic kind of, I'll call it a methodology or an observation by some Christians online. Some are friends of mine that I talk to. Others I don't have close connections with. And specifically the ones who are pioneering this position are Lydia and Tim McGrew, mainly Lydia on New Testament stuff, from what I understand, even though her and her husband, I'm sure, are in the same boat on this idea. I contacted you a while back. I said, Jeff, of course, I call you first name. We have that kind of relationship, but Dr. Tripp for the internet, I said, you really looked at Baucham's. I witnessed stuff, his names, very critically, but also very carefully. You probably saw some really good stuff. You also probably saw maybe overdoing it in some ways. And you're very, very honest in sifting through the material. So I said, what if I could get someone like him, who's also a mathematician, which means Bayesian probability. Here we go. And this is exactly what the undesigned coincidence position is like, doing some math here. Can I get him to read this book? Will he do it? Will he do it? How can I twist his arm? One day you had a situation where you had time and you were like, send me the book. So I sent you the book. And that was which book was it again I sent you?
Hidden in Plain View.
Hidden in Plain View. You read and you came up with some observations, and that's what we're here doing today. So you haven't read all the work.
Yeah.
But what are we doing today? What is our goal?
Well, we're looking at her argument. I essentially, like, I don't know anything about the McGrews. I know very little about Christian apologetics. It's not my world. They're not the particular questions that I'm interested in. If I look at it, it's sort of from a reception history point of view. So if they have an interesting reading and it lines up with something I'm looking at, then I might pay attention. But it's sort of, I'm coming at this with very fresh eyes. So I have no prejudgments about what they're doing. It's just sort of like, oh, this is an interesting world I get to dive into. Right. So we study the same texts, and the interesting thing for me is we come at it with different training, different assumptions, and different questions. So like the different questions is something I'm going to keep coming back to today, is that, well, here are the questions she's asking. These are the questions I would be asking. And it just will highlight that we're sort of approaching them from very different angles.
Right.
I'm going to approach this sort of like a book review, because you're like, here, read this book and tell me what you think. So if I'm writing a book review, I write a lot of book reviews. There are three big things I would want to address. So what is she doing? Like, what is an undesigned coincidence? In what ways does it work? So in what ways is her book successful? So I don't want to be like, even if I'm critical, I don't want to be completely negative.
Right.
And then how does it not work? And we'll probably spend a lot more time on that question than the first couple of questions. But it is worth pointing out like ways that this does work, and then turning to the ways that it sort of is resting on sand. There's a weak foundation to it, and that's some of the things that I'm going to highlight.
Okay. I just want to paint a picture for our audience, and also to understand where you're at. You painted yours in saying, look, you don't even know them. I personally don't know them, but I know apologists who pioneer their positions online. And so, you know, I'm kind of the antagonistic, critical point of view. I already have an opinion on this particular, I'll call it a hypothesis of undesigned coincidences and stuff. But I wanted you to come in a fresh academic, new eyes, not someone who lives in the online world. So there's not really this chip on your shoulder like maybe I might present, or an axe grinding kind of thing. I wanted to allow you on, and I don't want to put words in your mouth during this interview. I want to allow you to say what you honestly think, and allow the audience to also make their judgment call. I've heard only very few people in the past make videos in critical response, thoroughly going through this kind of thing. What I think you might be doing today, and we might get into some examples, but I imagine the ones who believe this would want you to deal with this is what always happens, by the way, every single example that they have come up with. They expect you to unravel every single thing. Instead, what scientists will probably do is go back and say, what is your methodology and how are you approaching this? And once you see how that's working, then you realize you won't have to run to every single pericope to find this particular thing and draw some conclusion that makes you have this maximalist case. Online, apologists have kind of a internal fight struggle. There are minimal facts arguments where apologists say, even the most secular scholars, for the most part, except maybe one or two, say Jesus existed and say this and then say that. And they like, now that we all agree on that, now let's make a case. Why would they die for what they believe? Why would they do? And the minimal facts argument is trying to argue for the reliability, but also the trustworthiness of the early witnesses and why this is something you should believe. The maximal case says, you guys don't see all the holes in your case. And no wonder skeptics aren't buying the gospel that you're trying to sell. We have a better case, and it's the maximal case. And we have this undesigned coincidence thing, and it makes it so much more reliable. So we can bring the gospels in. We can bring everything pretty much into the picture, and we have a much better case. This is to give you kind of the online, what's going on between both worlds. So I know that you don't hear this. You don't. Yeah.
Well, I did notice she makes an argument against the minimal facts argument. Like, so in her conclusion, she takes on the minimal facts people. So I got a little wind of this internal fight reading this book. I don't know. This is from 2017. So I don't know how far this has developed in the last couple of years. Do you want to pull up the?
Absolutely. Let's pop that up. Here we are.
Yeah.
And
so
just,
2017. So I don't know
to defend you, though, you're not attacking. I want to make that very clear. This is not an attack. This is going to be a critical response, though, I think. So.
Yeah. And yeah, I have, I think apologetics as a sort of devotional practice, it's a religious devotional practice. I think if I were a fundamentalist, I would probably want to be one who would practice apologetics as part of my devotional faith, because it would be the interesting thing for me. Like, I think it's intellectually engaging, that it brings you really close to the text. It's, so it's interesting to sort of delve into this world. But from my different perspective, I think, I'll highlight how I might have some issues in, for example, using hidden in plain view in my own work. If I were writing an article and it touched on one of these scenes, I would still be very reluctant to use a work like this to support a case, even if I happen to agree with it on a particular point. Again, like you said, because there are fundamental problems with the methodology, so it raises a lot of questions even before you get to the details. So I figured we could start off by showing people in a case. And this case is one that is interesting for me because I happen to be working on this scene in John. So that's why I picked it. So in John's Last Supper, there's this strange incident where Jesus gets up from table, takes off his clothes, gets on his knees, and starts washing the disciples' feet. And then tells them, and so Peter's at first horrified by this, and he says, one, if you want to share in my share in heaven, you need to go along with this. And two, if I'm willing to do this, you guys need to be willing to do this. And when I teach this text, it's one of my examples of how a literalistic reading is often not a literal reading, because very few Christians in the history of Christianity have read this passage and been like, oh yeah, then we need to wash people's feet. Even though it's very direct, like this, I've given you an example to follow. And they're like, yeah, but Jesus and his metaphors. So what the problem with this scene is, though, is you have this really important night. You have the Last Supper. You have this very notable scene. So Jesus gets up and acts like an enslaved person, because it would most often be an enslaved person who you would send in to wash somebody's feet. And in fact, the thing that I'm interested in is most often, disproportionately often, in socially and literally, like in literature, literarily, it would be an enslaved woman. So this is part of the reason his disciples are so horrified, as he's acting not only like an enslaved person, but like an enslaved woman. That's really notable. It doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. So it raises doubts about its reliability. Like, did this really happen on that night, or even at all, much less on that night? Why did nobody else feel the need to mention this? So McGrew's way of approaching this, I put a quick passage from her, says, it's certainly possible that Jesus did this on that particular night for no special reason. Perhaps he simply wanted to teach this lesson about mutual service and humility before his death, as he instituted the Lord's Supper on the same night. Incidentally, you wouldn't know that he instituted the Lord's Supper if you only had John, but we'll put that to the side. Still, one cannot help wondering why he washed their feet and drew the moral from it just then. this is what I mean by asking different questions. So she assumes it happened. If John says it happened, it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, why did Jesus do it this night?
Right.
What I feel like I have is the text. So my question would be more, why does John narrate this episode here? Putting to the side whether or not this actually happened, if it did happen, so let's say it really did happen, the fact is still that neither Luke nor Mark nor Matthew says anything about this. So why does John feel it's important to put this in? That would be the question I would ask, because I have the text, I don't have Jesus.
Right. It's a really important, I love starting here because you're separating a text from what we're supposing historically occurred.
Mm-hmm.
All you have is this text. You don't have what actually occurred and saw it. We did not actually see it. There's a lot of built-in assumptions in this kind of thinking that what we're seeing in the text, well, we found because it's like a cumulative case in their mind. Well, we know there's people, places, and things that are real that the gospel speak about. So they kind of approach this like trustworthiness of assuming if he said it, it most likely happened. And so they just assume. Whereas you're dealing with it with a more critical, careful saying, what is this author's intent with this scene? You're not saying it didn't happen, but you're not assuming it did. And so this is the thing, I think, that's just the difference in how you're approaching it, what the questions you might be asking, and so forth.
Yeah. I'm not assuming it did. I'm not assuming it didn't. That's a secondary, tertiary, way down the line sort of question.
Right.
And so the way she approaches this is in this last line. Well, if we could find an explanation in another gospel, this would be interesting and satisfying. And where she finds that is in Luke. So in Luke's version, he also has a distinct element. So he inserts here this dispute about who among the disciples is greatest. And at the end, he gets to, is it not the one, or he says, let the greatest among you become as the youngest and the leader as one who serves. For who is greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I'm among you as one who serves. So you can see how these things fit together. So it's Jesus presenting himself as one who serves, and literally as somebody who leaves table. He's not reclining at the table. And this is what actually happens in John. So instead of just having the teaching about it, John sort of narrates an episode that illustrates what he's talking about here.
Okay.
So the problem here is that we have a distinct element in Luke, we have a distinct element in John, and then we have Matthew and Mark that don't have anything about this. So her way of going about that is to conclude that both these things happen. Luke only includes the teaching. John only includes the episode. And Matthew and Mark, for whatever reason, choose not to include either. The coincidence, so she calls these undesigned coincidences. The coincidence is that we have this servant imagery in the same scene at the same meal on the same night.
Right.
So we have something that fits together, but the undesigned part is that John, if John's later, or Luke, if Luke's later, are not copying directly. They're not explicitly building on the other one. So they just have something that sort of fits together. And in her way of going about it, these would be independent traditions that they're each reflecting this idea that servant imagery came up at the Last Supper.
Right.
For me, this would raise different questions. So one, is it an actual coincidence? So the suffering servant is an image that is connected with Jesus's death throughout the New Testament and throughout early Christianity. So when you have his last meal, it would make sense to introduce servant imagery. And you can make the argument that Luke simply takes this imagery from elsewhere in Mark, because the same language appears in Mark and Matthew, just much early in a very different context. So does Luke see this earlier in Mark, at least one of his sources? If you're a Farrer person, it would be two of his sources. See this earlier in Mark and then decide to put this, because he wants to build this suffering servant imagery into the Last Supper, bring it up here. John explicitly connects it to his death. He lays down his clothes and then takes them back up again. Just like in John 10, he lays down his life and takes them back up again. He echoes his own language to explicitly connect this to his death.
Right.
So that's one thing. It could just be coincidental that both of them thought servant imagery would be appropriate at the Last Supper. Is Luke reliable when he moves that language here? So did Jesus actually say this on that night? Or has Luke taken some creative freedom, taken some teaching that appeared earlier in his source and moved it up? So should we question Luke's reliability, or did Jesus just teach this a whole lot and they kept having disputes about who is greatest? Like, did this sort of episode happen multiple times? And then we get into the question of dependence. So, and this is going to be a constant difference between me and McGrew. It's particularly in the latter half of the gospel, so in the Passion narrative, that John and Luke have a lot of odd similarities. And you will find a lot of scholars that would say John is dependent on Luke in his Passion narrative. Mm-hmm. You'll also find a couple that will say Luke is dependent on John. So like Mark Mattson would say Luke here is influenced by John. So John scholars would look at this and say, well, John creates this episode to illustrate the teaching that he finds in Luke. Somebody else might say Luke puts in this teaching. He doesn't want to illustrate. He doesn't want to put this whole episode in. It's too much material, but he puts in this teaching that he already has because he knows John. That question isn't resolved. Just because they're slightly different doesn't mean that I would say John and Luke are necessarily totally independent on this question.
Is it me jumping the gun by just expressing to our audience what's happening here? Is the question you're bringing up, and I think she brings up in the book, but doesn't really dwell on it, doesn't really deal with it, is that we know we have really good evidence to suggest these authors in some way among the synoptic problem are in communication, awareness of each other. Someone, whatever order you want to put it in, because I don't even want to get lost into, this is the example, Farrer hypothesis, Matthean priority, this, that, Luke, and I don't even want to get there. The point is, there's literary reasons to say that they are dependent on each other. How can you really factor stuff to undesigned when they are dependent? This is the biggest hiccup I have on assuming coincidence when we can assert with clear evidence they're dependent. That is such a problem to me. I can't see over that hill. I'm not saying that it couldn't be. It's just that's a big, sore thumb in my eye. I can't unsee it. So I don't know if I just stepped on your presentation, but I'm like,
no, I mean, this is, so I would say her method is, if they are different than any distinct details in any gospel, and I'm going to be focusing kind of more on the gospels, but we'll get to Acts. But any distinct detail, no matter where you're talking about, she would chalk up to independent tradition. And she would just say, well, because it's not so close, because I can't imagine a reason for John to create this episode or insert this episode based on Luke, therefore John must not care about what Luke's doing. And so even if he knew him, this is independent tradition. And it's totally possible that you had this episode attached to the Last Supper and you had this teaching attached to the Last Supper before John and Luke.
Right.
And even if John does know Luke, he could have read Luke, seen I'm among you as one who serves, and he's like, you know what? I don't want to put this in, but I do want to put in that other episode because nobody's put in that episode. And I think that foot washing is really important. So I don't know that that's not the case. But then the coincidence of having servant imagery is lessened somewhat. It's not that John just happened to put in this and Luke just happened to put in that. One could have inspired the other, even if they had independent traditions. So
I get it. Yeah.
So there's just I wouldn't want to jump all the way there. I would want to explore other possibilities first.
Got it.
So in McGrew's way of doing this, if she can come up with an historical explanation for both of them, that's not literary, not these other ways of going about it, she can put aside all those other questions that I might have. And so that's the sort of standard that she goes on.
Got it.
So who is this book for? Like, who do I think would enjoy this book? Because I want to say, like, she writes clearly. She writes accessibly. I read it very easily, and I was never frustrated with the writing or anything like that. Like, she's easy to understand. It's an easy structure to pick up and down. So it's repetitive. I mean, it's very repetitive, but it's got an easy enough structure that you could be like, okay, I'm just going to read a couple of these, put it down. You could leave it for 2 weeks and come back to it, and you'd be fine. Right. You don't need to like keep the last one in mind. So any Christian, probably any Christian for whom the New Testament is the only first century literature they've read, really, like, not terribly familiar with first century culture, and who has some sort of positive stake in the Gospels being reliable history, or in Acts and Paul, Acts being reliable history. So if you were into that, you would enjoy this book and probably get really into it. Probably share it with a friend. So that's sort of her audience, her key audience there. And I will say, like, when I got through it, I read through it the first time, and I had written a ton of critical notes in the margins, but I enjoyed it. Like, I didn't hate the book. Right. So that's an odd feeling to have, because normally if I'm reviewing a book and I'm just super critical of it, I also, start to dislike it a little. And so I had to ask this question, like, why did I enjoy it, even though, like, I had all these critical things to say about it? And I came to a note I wrote on like page 30 that I think explains it, because this is New Testament fan theory. And I enjoy fan theories. I like going on YouTube or Reddit or somewhere and seeing like somebody kind of work out a fan theory about a movie or a book or something. So I want to give you a couple of fan theories just so we can see what I mean by a fan theory.
Okay, yeah. So,
do you know any for Ferris Bueller?
Do I know what?
Do you know any fan theories about Ferris Bueller? It's all in Cameron's head. So if it's all in Cameron's head, Cameron's the sort of mopey friend. If you've ever seen this movie, there's a mopey friend, and then Ferris is this impossibly lucky, impossibly charming guy that has this amazing day. And the fan theory is this is more explainable, this impossibly lucky, impossibly charming person, if it's just Cameron's fantasy about the kind of day he would like to have. If he could just be a Ferris Bueller, he could have this amazing day. Instead, he's just homesick at his house. It also, for people from Chicago, so I'm sorry to anybody who hasn't seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Maybe I'm aging myself. But for people from Chicago, it also explains how you can do all that crap on one day. Because they go to Wrigley Field for a baseball game. They're at Sears Tower. They're at the art museum. They're all over the place. And it's just physically impossible to do that. So if I watch it, being from Chicago, I'm like, there's no way you're getting all this crap done in one day.
Yeah.
But if you're a kid at home fantasizing about it, then you're going to hit all these like hot spots in Chicago. And you're going to be like, oh yeah, I remember going to Sears Tower on a field trip. Oh, I remember going to Wrigley Field with my dad. So this is a fan theory about Ferris Bueller's Day Off. What about The Dark Knight?
Oh yeah, I know more about The Dark Knight, but yeah.
So there's a fan theory about the Joker, that the Joker is a vet and he's ex-special ops. So it explains the scars, if he was either tortured or in some sort of combat. And it explains how he's so good with weapons and tactical planning. Because, I mean, he pulls off some like really impressive stuff. And if he had training in that, it would make a little more sense. Okay. Here's one that I think is a little more on point for what we're doing. It's the Grand Unified Pixar Theory. The Grand Unified Pixar Theory is that all the Pixar movies take place in the same universe at different points in the timeline. So WALL-E, Cars take place in the distant future. Toy Story is more like right now. And what they build this on is, for example, you have certain similarities between the movies. You have sentient talking animals through different movies. You have sentient talking machines through different movies. So Toy Story, Cars, WALL-E, you have these intelligent machines. But you also have these like little details that they focus on. So, for example, in multiple movies, you have a Walmart-like chain called By and Large. Now, By and Large exists in Pixar movies and doesn't exist anywhere else. So it exists in these worlds, but in no other narrative worlds. You also have, through almost all the movies, the Pizza Planet truck shows up in almost all Pixar movies. So Pizza Planet is a chain of pizza places that exists in Pixar movies, doesn't exist anywhere else. So why do I think this is a fan theory? Well, first of all, in order for a fan theory to work, in order for you to generate a fan theory, you need beloved stories. You need stories that you come back to over and over and over again. You don't see fan theories about a movie somebody saw once and then never watched again. So Ferris Bueller's Day Off, for people like my age, you grew up watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off on TBS every Saturday. The Dark Knight, people really love that movie. They come back to it over and over again. The Pixar movies, people grew up watching that as children. So you get involved in these worlds. You sort of don't want to leave these narrative worlds. And I would say arguably that's the same for McGrew and the Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters, that she loves these narrative worlds. She goes and spends time in these narrative worlds. She probably goes and reads the Gospels or reads Acts as a way of just, I just want to spend some time in Mark's world for a while. And I'm just going to read some stories about Jesus. So first of all, that's one way that her way of going about things works like a fan theory. The second thing you need is you need to notice an inconsistency or an unanswered question. So in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you have Ferris's luck, his geography, like I mentioned, it just doesn't work out. In The Dark Knight, they raise the question of Joker's scars by bringing it up multiple times, but telling different stories. So it raises this question of, well, how did he get the scars? And then he asks the question, do I look like someone with a plan? And it's like, yeah, dude, you do. It took meticulous planning to pull all this crap off. What are you talking about? You don't look like you're a dog chasing a car. You definitely are a planner. So, and then with the Pixar movies, you have the Easter eggs, you have the similar characters and stuff like that. So when you look at the Gospels, the problem is the differing timelines, the differing geography. We're going to get to some of that. And the different presentation of scenes. So you have just all these like little differences between them that like it almost fits together, but then I can't quite fit this thing from Mark into Luke, or I can't quite fit this thing from Luke into John. So it raises questions about the reliability of the Gospels and Acts for readers. So in a way, McGrew's book is a reaction to biblical studies. You need biblical studies there first, highlighting these problems for her to then come in and say, this is how I can solve it.
Right.
By the way, and I'll just mention this and we'll move on. I didn't take it terribly personally, but if you're a person like me, you are skeptical, and she makes this claim 17 times. I have a PDF, so I just did a Control F on it, but 17 times I'm skeptical. She is unbiased. She listens with an unbiased ear.
Right.
So there are a fair amount of ad hominem attacks in here, but
you weren't offended though.
Oh no, I was like, oh, okay, whatever. But I mean, I am skeptical, so it's fine. But
same.
there is a sort of us versus them in her rhetoric,
Right.
which that's why I say when I like, who's the audience of this? Well, you would have to be somebody who would respond to that us versus them rhetoric.
Got it.
And then the last big thing is you want an in-universe solution to the problem. So if I want to know why is Ferris Bueller impossibly lucky and charming and all this crap happens in Chicago on one day, dude, John Hughes made the movie. John Hughes loves Chicago. He fit in all his favorite parts of Chicago into the movie. But that's an out-of-universe explanation. I don't want that. I don't want to hear about his narrative conventions that he's been playing with. I don't want to hear about the director as a person. I want a solution that takes place within the narrative universe of the movie.
Right.
So when we talk about The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan made it. There's your answer. Why are there unanswered questions? Because there's no Christopher Nolan movies without unanswered questions. Dude loves them. Why is Joker a meticulous planner? That's a stock character in a Christopher Nolan movie. He loves meticulous planners. So that's why he wrote that character that way. That's why he directed him that way. But again, that's an out-of-universe explanation. So we can talk about Pixar. These guys are at the same studio. And, I should highlight this. Why are there talking animals and talking machines? Because they're cartoons. That's just a trope of the genre. That's how you tell those sorts of stories. Nobody's baffled that there's a talking animal in Ratatouille or an intelligent animal in Ratatouille. If I'm watching like The Godfather and a talking rat shows up, I'm going to be a little surprised. But in a cartoon, I'm not going to be surprised. So when we turn to the Gospels and Acts, the sort of out-of-universe explanations I might bring up are, well, is there literary dependence? How are they creatively rewriting each other? Are these storytelling tropes? There's a way you tell this story, and that's why they included this detail. If I'm talking about Acts and Paul's letters, the disputed letters, is somebody just forging it? Like, is there pseudepigrapha? We use the polite term pseudepigrapha, but is somebody just forging a letter by Paul? Like, these are outside of the narrative universe. What she wants is an in-universe answer that doesn't take her out of that world in order to answer things. So all of those on the right there are basically biblical studies answers. And so she doesn't want those sorts of answers. I think the book works as New Testament fan theory. How do I focus on these issues? How do I focus on these scenes in more depth and contemplate how these details got there without leaving the narrative world and not thinking about the authors, not thinking about the culture, not thinking about things like this? So that's what's positive about it. I enjoyed it as fan theory. When she tries to make it work as historical method, that's when I start to see problems. That's where my critical notes start coming in. And there are some fundamental problems that make it unusable. So it's not that she has a solid framework and then just does it badly. She has a weak, unstable framework, so it kind of doesn't matter how well she does it. If you're building on sand, it doesn't matter how strong the house is, it's going to sink. So this is where I'm going to take a very sort of broad view and start to narrow in.
Okay. And I love this, by the way. I love how you're taking your time. I do think that it is, I personally, I look at this stuff like epics. It's almost like its own foundation mythology of the narrative, a story of Jesus. So in a way, I actually think the authors are writing a fan fiction for the people who are going to read this, whoever they may be. But I do think on a literary level, I tend to go with Robin Walsh on this. But you know, I do think that this is kind of the intention is in some way to get you indulged into the world that you're reading. And I think they did a good job of doing that, which is why this book exists, in my opinion. But everybody, Dr. Tripp is very meticulous. He is into the details and he knows some math. So stay tuned, because this whole Bayesian probability thing, the whole foundation, he said, let's get deep into this. I'm looking forward to this. Hit the like button. If you have any super chats, I promise you we'll get to your questions and super chats once we're done with the presentation.
So my first big problem is, just on a very broad level, the argument is circular. So here's what I mean. You have this problem. There are inconsistencies in facts, character, and style between the Gospels or between Acts and Paul's letters, but we want all of them to represent the same historical reality. So I'm not just talking about contradictions. I'm not just talking about, Jesus puts the overturning of the tables of the temple 2 years before Jesus' death. Mark puts it a week before his death. Those are contradictions. I'm saying John's Jesus talks like John. That's not a contradiction, but it does raise an eyebrow. Or why is Jerusalem dangerous in Mark, or dangerous in Matthew, but it's like the bee's knees in Luke? Like, the characterization of the city is very different between the two. So it's just this inconsistency of how they present stuff. And it raises questions about reliability. So what we would be comfortable saying is you have different authors creatively telling a story based on history. So you're bound to find some mix of fact and fiction. And the difficulty is parsing out, what do you think is fact and what do you think is fiction? But she can't have that. There's no fiction involved. So let's assume for the moment that the narratives are reliable history.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that this exercise can trigger some. Please, I'm trying my best to let's play in the sandbox together here. I'm trying to encourage people, because I know there's some but it's not. Okay, you're no fun. Don't be a party pooper here. Let's assume.
This is McGrew's step one. Let's assume. This is how we'll get in. So we have these, so say back to the example I gave. We have this weird episode in John washing people's feet. We have this weird teaching or out of place teaching in Luke about a servant and Jesus acting like a servant. So let's assume for the moment that both of them are telling reliable history.
Got it.
Now, the challenge is, can I imagine a plausible scenario that leads to both or all of these different textual details? So can I do this? And if I can, then I conclude that the stories are reliable history. Well, yeah, but that was one of your assumptions. You assumed, you only asked the questions you asked, or did the imagining you imagine, because you assume they were reliable history. It's not then surprising that you would conclude that they're reliable history. If you didn't assume that they were reliable at the get-go, lots of types of explanations open up for why John has this and Luke has this and Matthew and Mark don't have either of them. But you have, in order to weed all those out, you have to say, I'm going to assume they're reliable, and then I'm going to conclude that they're reliable. So what I would be impressed with is a methodology that says, I'm not going to assume anything about the text, and then I'm going to go to the data in the text and see if it leads me to believe they are reliable. What she does is assumes they're reliable from the get-go, and then the new data is her imagination. So can I imagine a scenario that explains the data, therefore it's reliable? And so
yes, you can imagine
Mhm.
several scenarios that could explain data with that assumption, like you said, with that assumption. So many, ignoring so many other issues, though. That's, yeah.
So that's my first fundamental problem with this, is that her conclusion is baked into her assumptions. You only rule out all these other ways of doing things if you're going in assuming your conclusion. But let's say we put that to the side. So that's fundamental problem number one. But we're going to ignore that broad issue. Then we'll go to a more specific point about her methodology, which is she just ignores contradictions and inconsistencies. So this is just one quote from many. Entire books have been written on the subject of alleged contradictions in the Gospels. So alleged contradictions, because they can't actually be contradictions.
Of course.
And this is not one of those books. But the decision not to be led into lengthy discussions of that topic is not solely the result of my desire to maintain focus. There's a reason for that focus itself. I believe that an understanding of the case from undesigned coincidences helps us to see the forest and not get lost in the trees. So if you focus on the coincidences, it's you not seeing the forest for the trees. And she follows through on this, unless occasionally she will talk about contradictions or inconsistencies, but only if they're easy to explain or easy to dismiss.
Right.
But for the most part, she doesn't bother with them. And her justification for this is something I've seen in other, even like biblical studies, that's aiming to argue for the reliability of the gospel. So she points to this J. Warner Wallace, who is a former detective and a Christian apologist at Biola. So he says, no single witness is likely to have seen every detail, so I must piece together the accounts, allowing the observations of one eyewitness to fill in the gaps that may exist in the observations of another eyewitness. True, reliable eyewitness accounts are never completely parallel and identical. Instead, they are different pieces of the same puzzle, unintentionally supporting and complementing each other. Okay, so one, we'll put to the side that this is not the same. I've seen this comparison made a lot, but I've also seen it refuted by people who are talking about the difference between, say, having an eyewitness orally give you their testimony closely after the fact and writing a fully formed biography 40 years after the fact. Those are different endeavors. There's going to be different pressures. We also make an effort to keep eyewitnesses separate before we can get their statements on things, because we don't want cross-contamination. We don't have any of those assurances. And in fact, like you brought up, we have plenty of evidence that there was lots of cross-contamination between the Gospels. So I already have issues with this as a justification. But even if we grant it, so again, if we grant it, there's one big problem. Detectives do not decide on the reliability of testimony. Judges and juries decide on the reliability of testimony by hearing arguments for and against its reliability. It's a defense attorney's job to point out inconsistencies in the testimony, if that any witness that the prosecutor brings forth. So essentially what she's doing, not giving you the contradictions and inconsistencies. She only wants you to hear from the prosecutor, which makes it a show trial. Like if you have like a Soviet show trial, yeah, you'll get your guilty verdict, but you won't necessarily get a true verdict, or you frequently will get an untrue verdict. You have judges and juries specifically hear two sides of something in order to make a more informed judgment. So this analogy from detective work just doesn't work for me.
Right.
Like, I want to hear all the details. I'm more impressed if I read a book and the person is like, here's the best case against me. Let me point you to all the people who would say I'm wrong. I want you to read those people. And I want to point out all the weaknesses in my own argument. In the last publication I did, I have a whole section where I'm like, if you want to build on what I'm doing, here's how to prove me wrong, because I know a lot of you are going to disagree with me. So I have pages of, here are some methods for proving me wrong. Go down these routes and you might have a good chance of just sweeping me off the board, because that's sort of our job if we want to get at the truth. The other issue is she calls these coincidences. And the problem with calling them coincidences and then treating them like this is that coincidences only have meaning in light of the conflicts. So let me give you an example. I've got a kid who's on a like pee-wee football team, and he wants to be the kid to go out and call the coin flip. He's like, I'm awesome, coach. I'm awesome at it. I can call the coin so good. So his friend starts flipping a coin and he starts calling it. And his friend's on his side. His friend's like, oh yeah, this is amazing. He's like, heads, see, he called heads. It's amazing. Oh, he got it again. Great. That's some of the people who are standing around listening to this are going to be like, man, he really does call a coin really well. That's pretty impressive. Like, maybe we should make him the captain so he can call the coin. That's very different than if somebody was just standing by who didn't have a stake in the decision, going same, different, same, different, different, same. Like, if you're just calling the similarities and the differences, then you would be like, well, about half the time you were right, because that's what we expect. Right. And so if you did it 100 times and he got 70 right, that's remarkable. But if you did it 100 times and he only got 53 right, you'd be like, that's about what we'd expect. Let me give you another example, because this just came up while I was reading this. So I'm going to run a scam. I've got my hands on 512,000. I did not come up with this. I got this off of TikTok. So I've got my hands on 512,000 contacts. And before the first game of the NFL season, I'm going to message half those contacts and tell them Team A is going to win. And I'm going to message the other half and say Team B is going to win. Now, let's say Team A wins. I'm never going to message the people I said Team B was going to win again. But all the ones I got right, the Team A people, I'm going to message them again the next week, the day before the game. Half of them, one team's going to win. Half of them, the other team's going to win. Whoever I get wrong, never talk to them again. Whoever I get right, I'm going to keep messaging. I do this 9 weeks in a row. I still have 200 people on my list. And those 200 people have seen me get the game right the day before 9 weeks in a row. I have a 100% success rate with those people. So on week 10, I changed my message. For the low price of $5,000, I will tell you who's going to win tomorrow. Now, all they know is that I have gotten every game right this season. So some of them are going to be tempted. And if all of them do it, I've got a good payday there. But the problem, I'm going to get up to $1 million. The problem is they're only being scammed because they don't know the conflicts. They don't know all the times I got wrong.
Right.
I literally got 50% right by design. And yet they don't know this because they didn't look at the inconsistencies between what I said and what happened. And therefore they're going to have a bad judgment of how truthful I'm being. So you need to look at, if you're going to look at coincidences, they only have meaning in light of the times that it doesn't work out. You need to compare both in order to have any sort of meaning. So I don't agree with the idea of just not looking at the conflicts and contradictions. And here we are. There's a fundamental failure of Bayesian reasoning. And this connects back to our justification. So this connects back to the detective. So let's ignore the circular argument and let's just grant that we can ignore inconsistencies because we believe that undesigned coincidences alone, just on their own, are worth noting. This is meaningful. I mean, citations are like that. If I cite that I'm quoting Isaiah and then I quote Isaiah, you know I know Isaiah.
Right.
It doesn't matter how much I change out of Isaiah. You know I'm familiar with the text. So maybe undesigned coincidences are just worth noticing on their own. So what Bayes looked at was conditional probabilities. So to give you an example, let's say I picked a random animal and I want to know what is the likelihood that I picked a dog. But I'm going to give you a little information. I'm going to give you a hint. I did pick a mammal. Well, it's still not very likely that I picked a dog. So the probability that I picked a dog, even given the information that I picked a mammal, is probably less than 1%. I mean, you have primates and water mammals and non-dog canines, all sorts of mammals that aren't dogs. But let's say I switch that up, and this is where Bayes comes in. Bayes focused on what happens when you switch what information you have and what information you're trying to calculate the probability of. So now let me ask, what is the probability that the animal I picked is a mammal if I give you the information that it's a dog? Well, then it's 100%.
Right.
And these are wildly different probabilities. So one is close to 0 on one extreme, and one is exactly 100 on the other extreme. So Bayes focused on the idea that these two probabilities, if you switch up what you know and what you're trying to find, are not the same. And there's a relationship. Bayes' theorem has a formula. If you know all the inputs to the formula, you can go from one to the other. But most of the time, those are not the same probability. And just because one is extremely likely, in this case, one is certain, but the other one is extremely unlikely. So switching them gives you no assurances about what the value is. Her precedent says that the probability that one will find undesigned coincidences, if I give you the information that it's reliable testimony, that probability is high. I mean, she doesn't have a long discussion of it. I'm willing to trust her. She spends all of 2 pages on this argument, but sure, if I grant you that argument, what your precedent shows is that if I know it's reliable testimony, I expect to see undesigned coincidences. But that's not her method. Her method is to treat it like the probability that testimony is reliable, given that one finds undesigned coincidence, is high. She switches dogs and mammals. So
no wonder there's so much confidence and certitude in a lot of the apologists who push this view. They have that in their mind. It's almost like certain that what they're looking at is the case, but
it's we just don't have. She hasn't provided any information. I don't know that she's wrong, but I don't know that she's right, and she hasn't given any argument in support of her actual method, which is to treat it like if I see undesigned coincidences, then it's a sign of reliability. So here's one comment. So she says, casual comments, allusions, and omissions that fit together are not what one would find in different fictional or fictionalized works written by different people. They're also not to be expected among different legendary stories that grew up gradually long after the events. So she almost pushes it to the idea that you will not see undesigned coincidences if you're talking about fictional accounts or even fictionalized, which I take to mean she's looking at like a historical account that I've then indulged. So then I wouldn't see these undesigned coincidences. So she finds 47 undesigned coincidences across 18 texts, some of them full volume works, which is about 2.5 undesigned coincidences a text. So then we have to ask the question, like, if I can go through a different set of texts, if I can find on average 2.5 undesigned coincidences per text, does that mean it's reliable testimony?
Using her method, the way that she's yes. In fact, that's why I gave people fair warning on the Apologia video. Get ready to start worshiping Heracles, Vespasian. I mean, look, we're going to find some undesigned coincidences. Hallelujah. I knew Heracles was the one. I loved his 12 labors. It just resonated in my soul. Anyway, being funny. So,
well, we'll start even more recently. We're going to prove that Bruce Wayne really is Batman, and that his parents were killed in an alleyway when he was a boy. So there are now 5 or 6 different tellings of this story across different movies, between the different Batman movies and even like a scene in Watchmen that has this image, only Owlman breaks in. So there are consistencies. There's a pearl necklace always involved. By the way, the pearl necklace wasn't in the original comic. That was a different type of necklace, but it caught on and it just became the way you tell this story. But okay, we have a consistent use of that, even though it's false. But it's always in or near an alleyway. So the Waynes are never killed skiing. They're never even killed, like they're never stabbed. They're always shot. So there's certain consistencies. There's a question of, is there one robber or two? Is there one mugger or two? So in Batman 89, there are 2 muggers. But in all the other versions, there's only one. Well, if I were approaching this from a McGrewian angle, I could say, well, one of them's the Joker in Batman 89, and the other one could be Joe Chill. We don't get a name for him, but he could be Joe Chill. So like Matthew sometimes has 2 demoniacs or 2 blind men, and the other gospels only have 1. I can just trust that Tim Burton is giving me the full story, and the other ones are only giving me part of the story. And in fact, if in the one on the right there is from the Joker, so that would be a Joe Chill figure, but he's wearing a clown mask. So it's very easy for you to understand how a small boy like Bruce Wayne would get those conflated. He's like, oh, it's part Joker, part, the Joker really killed mom and dad, but, I got a little confused. Now, there's also a conflict between the depiction of the scene and reality, because it takes place in Gotham and there's no Gotham City. But see, this is because you're skeptical and biased. The Gotham is a nickname for New York, and it was through the 1800s and early part of the 20th century. So it probably reflects how Bruce Wayne referred to New York when he told this story to his friends and family. But then you might come back, some scholar might come back and say, well, there's very few alleys in New York. It's not a Chicago or a Philadelphia where you have, alleys all over the place. There's very few alleys. But here's the thing. That only proves that it's more reliable, because there are some alleys. It's not impossible. And why would you make it up? Why would you make that detail up that there's an alleyway? So that just convinces me more that this is based on reliable testimony. And there are also undesigned coincidences in the fact that, for example, in some, you don't actually see the alleyway, but you see a steel door and a plain brick wall. Where are you going to find those? You're going to find them in alleyways. So that makes it fits without being explicit about depending on these other works. Why wouldn't you highlight the fact that it was an alleyway if you're making up your story about Bruce Wayne's parents being killed? Now, okay, so I'm being obnoxious, but I'm even willing to say, okay, this is garbage, but I'm willing to say that because this is too late. This is thousands of years later. This is a different form of media. Okay, well, we'll put this to the side.
Yeah, this is Dr. Tripp. Come on. I mean, this is obviously fiction. We all are in agreement this is fiction, but the Gospels,
But we were told last slide that we would not find undesigned coincidences in fiction or fictionalized work. So something must have changed literarily from the first century to the 20th century that we are now finding undesigned coincidences in fictional works. But okay, maybe the claim is that back then you wouldn't have found them.
That's what we're going to claim. Okay.
Okay, so Heracles. This is from Euripides' play, Heracles. And it has his wife turning to one of their sons. Now, his wife at this point thinks he's dead. He's been missing for years, and his last labor was to go down to Hades. So she thinks he just got trapped down there and he's dead. She doesn't know he's on the way back. So that's the sort of dramatic tension of the play. And at this point, she's talking to her sons, and she turns to one and she says, "To you, your father now gone would have assigned Argus. You would have had the seat of proud Eurystheus, the rich and productive fields of Palestia, throwing over your head the robe of the beast, the lion's skin in which he himself was armed." Now, there's multiple sons around. Why does this kid get the lion's skin? Because what she's referring to is the Nemean lion.
Right. One of the labors that Heracles had to defeat, this lion that was impenetrable, undefeatable. I mean, it just, of course, he snapped its neck and it took its mane.
So every sculpture you see of Heracles is either him killing the lion or him carrying the skin of the lion as like his armor.
Right.
Because it's impenetrable. But like, why would you bring up Argus and Palestia as the places if it's associated with Nemea? Like, that doesn't seem, if it were fictional, you would think that you would bring up the place that people would know, which is Nemea, not these other places. Well, Nemea is down in the Peloponnesus. So is Argus. Argus is a little ways off, but it's in the eastern Peloponnesus. Now, Palestia is not even like a place. It's not an official land. Nobody's king of Palestia. Okay. And there's even some inconsistency on where people refer to it with this name. But if we look at places in the appropriate time period that were referred to as Palestia, oh, wait. They're on the eastern side of the Peloponnesus, which includes Nemea. So, of course, if you had a son who was going to rule over a region that includes Nemea, you would want him to have the lion skin because that's something that those people would respect. So we have regions colloquially referred to as Palestia around Nemea. And she's just speaking naturally. In that time period, they're going to know where Palestia is. They're going to know where Argus is. So she doesn't need to spell out the fact that she's referring to this other story. She can just casually talk about this. So we have this undesigned geographical coincidence. And there are others. I'm not a devotional reader of Heracles' works.
Right.
I mean, I've read some, but
I'll look past your sins today.
Oh, okay. Yeah. He'll come after me himself. But I don't go to bed reading Euripides. I don't go to bed reading, Hercules Furens. And yet I just glanced through them and I found these sorts of undesigned coincidences between them. So what you would see is like, Hercules has just come from a certain labor and now he's in a certain town. And you're like, well, okay, how does that fit together? Well, he also has to go back to get his next labor, and that town is on the way to that labor. Now, that particular work doesn't mention any of that contextual information. So all it does is assume that you know it. But if I were reading this through a McGrewian lens, I would say, well, yeah, he doesn't need to mention it because this is just him relating what he reliably heard.
Right. Reportage model, right?
Yeah.
Like they keep bringing up.
So we're treating these sorts of illusions because that's all we would do in these cases. We would just treat them as illusions. People are familiar with the Hercules story, so they know where to put them at what times. But that's how we would treat Heracles, but we're sort of treating Jesus and Paul differently. And maybe the reason here is, well, this is way too long back. I mean, a couple slides ago, she did say that we shouldn't expect this from different legendary stories that grew up gradually along after the events. She made that claim, and we're sort of seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a fair point. They had a long time to be really familiar with the Heracles story and absorb it so much that they could make these allusions without really explaining them. So let's take something that's
just to paint the picture real quick is that Bruce Wayne, too close to us, not far enough back. Heracles, deep roots into antiquity, may even stem all the way back to freaking Hittites for all we know. I mean, this is a very old character that's found as stories down through, and maybe these are accurate. I mean, you're pointing out some clear things here, but it's so far back. We need to be closer to Jesus, Dr. Tripp.
Yeah. But we also, because part of the goal of Hidden in Plain View is to highlight that the undesigned coincidences happen in stories with no miraculous events and stories with miraculous events.
Right. So
when Vespasian became emperor, he happened to be in Alexandria in Egypt, and Suetonius, Tacitus, and Dio Cassius all relate the story of him finding out that he was emperor. And at the same time, they all relate a story of Vespasian healing a blind man with his spit. So very much like Jesus. And also healing a man with a withered hand or leg. It sort of depends on which version you're reading, but we're not here to concentrate on the inconsistencies. What is consistent is he heals him by stepping on him. So he puts his heel on the guy, and either on his hand or his leg, and it's healed. Each of them contains distinct elements to their story. So they each have distinct details. So in Suetonius, Vespasian offers a sacrifice to the god Serapis. So he goes into the temple, offers a sacrifice to Serapis. So not to any other gods, none of the other Egyptian gods, to that one specifically. And then Serapis is the god who tells the blind man and the man with the withered limb that they should go to Vespasian to be healed. So they have this visionary dream. Now in Tacitus, he doesn't include the sacrifice at the temple of Serapis. He just notes that Vespasian was waiting for summer weather to travel by boat. So it seems like it's sort of late spring, and he's waiting for the water to calm down before he travels back to Rome. But Serapis does show up in that he's the one that tells the disabled men to go to Vespasian. By the time we get to Dio Cassius, no sacrifice in the temple, no summer winds, but the Nile overflows, and it seems to have happened early. So it seems like Vespasian enters the city, and all of a sudden the land is flourishing with an overflowing Nile. And he doesn't mention Serapis at all. He only says that the men received a vision in dreams. So it doesn't say where it came from. All of these details, all of these distinct details, whether it's the sacrifice to Serapis in his temple, whether it's waiting for the summer winds, or whether it's the Nile overflowing a little early, point to late spring. They all point to late April, early May. So we have, but they're clearly not dependent on each other. So Tacitus shows no no evidence that he is concerned with the sacrifice to Serapis. And Suetonius shows no interest in the summer weather. Like they don't reflect each other at all in those distinct details, and yet they all agree on the timing of this event, which means they're undesigned coincidences. It's clear that Dio Cassius is not copying from Suetonius or Tacitus, and yet it fits together with what they said. So what McGrew might say is that this shows that Vespasian was in Alexandria in late spring when he became emperor. And I'd agree. But it doesn't prove that Vespasian actually healed these men.
Amen. Okay. I've been saying this, like, okay, we might find, as you talk about, and I'm sure you probably have it in your presentation, I feel like I'm skipping ahead, like characters might be from regions or something may have taken place, whether you take an oral memory angle, whether you take a particular testimonial, like, hey, this is just kind of like in early communities, people were talking about it. Your point in this is that they're not genetically dependent on each other for the source. So somehow Vespasian's narrative or story has been consistent through some type of spreading about how Vespasian did this, but they're all consistent also on him healing. Is it not mistaken? Hold on, let me see. Only, yeah.
So that he heals, and he heals the blind man in the same way. He heals the lame man in the same way. He uses the same technique. So there are other consistent details, but there are these distinct details that don't mirror each other, but they agree on a detail about the overall situation that this healing took place in. So to me, these fit the criteria for an undesigned coincidence. Right. Again, it's not super well defined, but based on the examples I see in her book, this would seem to fit. I think if this happened in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we would have an undesigned coincidence.
Based on her model. See, that word I have a problem with, and you do too, undesigned. In this case, if I would say there's a design, if I was going to say that there was something about this that was designed, it was that these are literary historians who are writing, and they knew to account this as part of something that they're writing, period. So if there is any design to it, is that this is the model in which these authors would have known to have written about Vespasian or written about their emperors or whatever. But they don't even need to be genetically communicating. I'm looking at the Gospels, and we could really use an undesigned coincidence in this account. She admits, unless she wants to die on a different hill, that they know of each other and in fact are using each other's work. So I don't know about you, but like that whole undesigned, just because something seems odd or it connects in a way that allows the other one to finish the incompleteness of the other narrative. When these authors know about the other work and they're using them, you see the problem, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I could apply that here. So let's say Tacitus has read Suetonius. I'm not familiar enough with Tacitus's writing habits to comment on what his propensities are, but it's entirely possible you might have a situation where Tacitus reads Suetonius and he sees Vespasian offering sacrifice to the god Serapis, and for whatever reason he doesn't like that. But he knows that signifies a certain time of year. Okay, so I need to signify that it's spring in a different way. Oh, so he's waiting for the summer winds. So it doesn't mean that he actually was waiting for the summer winds or what have you, but it looks undesigned because he consciously changed it.
Right.
If he had any objections to this image of the emperor sacrificing to an Egyptian god. But if there were dependence, then it really undercuts the idea that this is actually undesigned and a coincidence. You can be designing something to not match. or you could be designing something, like you said, to fill in a gap. So if we go back to the first one we had in the Last Supper, there are a lot of John scholars that look at that episode and say, what is happening here is John has read Luke, and he's not happy with this image of the disciples fighting with each other about who's greatest. Doesn't include that anywhere in his book. But he likes this idea of Jesus not reclining at the table and acting as a servant. So he narrativizes it. Instead of a teaching, he gives it as an episode that illustrates the same point. So they don't match on purpose, but there's still a coincidence. There's still the agreement in the theme because he's being inspired by Luke, but he just doesn't feel the need to actually follow Luke. Now, you may agree with those scholars or not, but there are other possibilities.
Yeah.
And you don't have to, just because you have a distinct detail doesn't mean you're completely independent of the other person, or it's based on reliable, independent tradition. There's any number of ways that that distinct detail could have come into the later work. Okay. So
I don't want to interrupt while you're in the middle of the presentation because there's so many things I'm sure we can wrap it on into.
Well, let's look at some actual examples. So we've been sort of going in and in.
Got it.
Like looking at just in general what the issue is. Now, what is the issue with her specific claims about undesigned coincidences? So now let's look at one key text. So I'm going to look at the feeding of the 5,000. And I'm going to look at that because this is like the trophy text. So there are 4 undesigned coincidences in like one block of stories. Now, granted, it shows up in all 4 gospels, so you had more opportunities. It's still an average of 1 per text, but it's contributing a lot. So what she looks at here, for example, in John is weird in that for most of the gospel, you know what time of year it is, if not the exact date. You don't know which year it is, but you know what, you know where on the calendar you are. He's weird like that. The other ones, you don't know exactly where you are on the calendar. And in John 6, when he gets to the feeding of the 5,000, he talks about the fact that it's just before Passover. If we turn to Mark, she connects that just before Passover to 2 distinct details in Mark. So he, first of all, says that many were coming and going. And he also notes that there was green grass. So these are sort of distinct to Mark. Now, here's her way of approaching it. One might first guess that the reference to many coming and going is merely another allusion to the fact that Jesus was often pressed and followed by crowds. And indeed, as the passage goes on, Mark does say that the crowds found a way to follow him. But the phrase, many were coming and going, is slightly odd as a description of Jesus's popularity alone, and suggests that there was some other reason for the general bustle of crowds in their vicinity. I don't know that I agree with her, but okay, we'll run with it. But Mark gives no further explanation for the busyness surrounding them. John does, though without any appearance of intending to explain anything at all when he says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. So this is the issue. Like, on the one hand, if it's Passover, what she says is she sort of imagines a bunch of pilgrims going to Jerusalem. They're coming and going. They're going on the road by Jesus. So you have these crowds of people going by Jesus, and that fits with John's claim that the Passover was at hand. Now, first of all, Mark doesn't have a standard way of talking about the many. So I'm not sure what is slightly odd. So slightly odd in what sense? He talks about many around Jesus on a lot of different occasions, but he never does it the same way twice. So many were coming and going, just to me fits within the variation that Mark has. It doesn't necessarily signify that something weird is going on. But she wants it to fit Passover. So we can also focus on the grass. In Mark, it says green grass. Matthew gets rid of the green. Luke gets rid of the reference to grass altogether. And in John, it's not entirely absent. So there's much grass. For me, this raises some questions about does Matthew and Luke kind of disagree with Mark and that's why they edit it out, or do they just treat it as an extraneous detail? So is Luke like, I don't need this. I need to get along. I need to compact this down, because his is a lot shorter. And Matthew often shortens Mark. So, does he just, I don't need to mention that it was green grass. There was a lot of grass. To an extent, I think the much grass sort of confirms Mark or agrees with Mark in that, at least when I lived in the desert, so I used to live in New Mexico, and there were areas that would spring up with grass when the sort of rains came in the summer. And when you were going by there before, it looked like barren and dirt with little tufts of grass. And then all of a sudden the rains would come through, it would flood through, and then now it looks like a big grassy field. So is John agreeing with Mark, but sort of putting in a detail that would be more consistent with him growing up in Palestine? But the point is, there is grass throughout. So there's an argument to be made that John knows what Mark is doing and understands the sort of implications of there being green grass. That it would be, the grass is not green all year long. It would be in the spring. So then it becomes a question of, are there other ways to explain this undesigned coincidence? So other questions this scene raises. First of all, before we even get on to anything, is it pure coincidence? Like, is it an actual coincidence? I mean, all you know is that both things happened in spring. If that's all you know, you have a 1 in 4 chance of that happening by mistake, by random chance. They just put it in a season. You have a 1 in 4 chance of that agreeing. Now in John, at least 13 chapters of John take place in spring. So it's more likely than not that something's going to take place in spring. John builds on the Passover imagery in his bread of life speech that follows. So if he wanted to give this bread of life speech and talk about the manna and all these kinds of things, then it would make sense to put a note in before all these episodes begin that it was almost Passover and make that connection. So what I think McGrew might point out rightly is Mark is very sparse on temporal indicators. You almost never know when Mark is taking place. So the idea that he added a temporal indicator and he added it in this particular story, okay, that's maybe pushing it too far. So we may not want to say it's pure coincidence. Does John know Mark? Does the green grass put it in John's head that this is taking place in the spring? So I'm going to change it to much grass. I'm going to put it just before Passover, because he tends to tie everything he's doing to specific festivals in the Jewish calendar. So, okay, this one's in spring. I'm going to put it just before Passover. And also, are we sure that Mark's grass is a historical detail at all? So I just listed a few passages here where grass growing in barren places is part of messianic predictions of what's going to happen in the messianic age. So in Deuteronomy, Yahweh will give grass in your fields for your livestock, and you will eat your fill. And now we have a miracle about eating your fill. And he incorporates this image of grass. Psalm 140, by the way, he refers to Deuteronomy 11, Mark does in Mark 12. So he knows this passage. In Psalm 147, he makes grass grow on the hills, and this is a recurring motif in the Psalms. In Isaiah 35, the grass will become reeds and rushes, so it would be very plentiful. But it would be much. There was much grass. But Mark also refers to or alludes to Isaiah 35 in Mark 7, so he knows this passage. Isaiah 66, your bodies will flourish like the grass. And again, this is incorporated in Mark 9. So Mark's familiar with these passages. Is it a historical detail at all? Or is it something he brought in to bring out this messianic motif of Jesus feeding the crowds? Again, I don't have an answer, but these are questions I would raise. Another one. Many were coming and going. Why ask Philip in John? So in Mark, in the Synoptics, he just asks the disciples. But in typical John fashion, he specifies who he was talking to, and he's talking to Philip. This raises the question of where does this miracle take place? Because there's tension between Mark and John. So in Mark, there's somewhere where the many were coming and going. And then they go to a wild place by boat, but it's within walking or following distance from the place they were originally. So the crowd sort of follow along the shore. So they didn't like diagonally cut across Galilee. Then he performs the miracle, and the disciples go ahead to the other side towards Bethsaida. So what it looks like in Mark is they started out on the west shore and they went east to Bethsaida. In John, Jesus went away to the other side of the Lake of Galilee in 6:1. So he's on the other side. From what we don't know, but he's on the other side. But then at the end of the story, they travel by boat across the lake to Capernaum, which looks like they were on the east shore and headed west. So Mark looks like they're on the west shore and headed east. John looks like they're on the east shore and headed west. Philip allows her to sort of construct a way of understanding this in which they're sort of zigzagging across the lake. So her solution is that they start in Capernaum, where Passover pilgrims are traveling by. I could bring up that one, she trusts Josephus way too much on his numbers, and he has a real propensity to exaggerate numbers. So he's like, millions come by, and it's like, probably not. And second, Ray Brown, at least in his commentary on John, points out that Capernaum wasn't on any major pilgrimage routes, but maybe there are enough people coming by. Okay. So Jesus starts in Capernaum, and then he leaves to Bethsaida, where he performs the miracle. Mark just doesn't mention that. So it's a detail in John. In Luke, by the way, because Luke mentions explicitly Bethsaida, but Mark just doesn't happen to mention that they went all the way across the lake to Bethsaida. So he starts over here, goes over here, then he comes back to Capernaum, as in John, so he can give his whole speech in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And then, so Mark doesn't mention that, doesn't feel the need to mention the synagogue episode, but then hops back in the boat and goes across to Gennesaret, so he can be in Gennesaret for the end of Mark, where they actually end up. I mean, it's possible, but there's a simpler way. What's creating this need to have Jesus zigzagging all over the place and still not have it be completely satisfactory is that both of these guys have to agree with each other. If you just do away with that assumption, a much easier solution presents itself. Mark has Jesus on the west side of the lake for the miracle. There's plenty of hills, plenty of mountains over there. Then the disciples head east toward Bethsaida. She makes a kind of snarky comment about that translation, but it's like, that's what those words mean. So I'm not exactly sure what problem she has with the translation, but it says they head toward Bethsaida. They get caught in the storm, and after meeting up with Jesus mid-lake, they land in Gennesaret, which is on the southeast side of the lake. So miracle on the west side, head east across the lake, storm happens, they get sort of diverted down to Gennesaret, and that's where the end of Mark takes place, Mark 6. John, if he doesn't need to agree with Mark, like Luke, has the miracle on the east side of the lake near Bethsaida. And Philip plays a role here because she claims, well, he asks Philip because Philip is from Bethsaida, explicitly in John. So the miracle happens on the east side. They head west, as John mentions multiple times. They were going across the lake to Capernaum. They got to where they were going. The crowds went to Capernaum. So John's is very simple. Start on the east, go west. And there's no zigzagging around. It's only when you have to make these two things fit together that you get Jesus bouncing back and forth across the lake. And then we have the 5,000 who now? So Mark says they ordered them to get all. They ordered them all to get them all to sit down by groups. So all is pantos. It's everyone. It's masculine, but that just means it's personal, not a thing. And they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. And what she focuses on here is the fact that they are consistent in saying men. The issue comes in Matthew, where it says those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Like, why does nobody else mention women and children? What she keys in John is 6:10, where he says, make the people sit down. So anthropoi. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So in her way of understanding, John is accommodating Matthew's women and children in a weird way, because Jesus orders them to sit down and only some of them do. So it's a weird detail for John to include, to say, well, a good chunk of the crowd just said, F off, Jesus. I don't feel like sitting down. But the people sit down, and then it's really the men who sit down, and they're 5,000. And we know they're 5,000 because they sat in their 50s and hundreds, and we could count them. Putting aside the fact that all of them it's about 5,000, or all the later ones. So are they consistent in adding to Mark about 5,000 because they're not happy with his precise number? I'm not sure. So it explains the count of men. It explains the stability of the 5,000, even if it does become about. We could point out analogies to like the 300 Spartans. We know exactly how many Spartans defended Sparta, even if it probably wasn't exactly 300 Spartans. In this way, John can allow Matthew to fit in with everybody else. So this is the undesigned coincidence. His vocabulary shift from anthropoi to androi is what allows Matthew to fit in. Okay, so let's grant McGrew's interpretation of the scene. So I've raised questions I would have, but let's say she's answered all my questions. I'm convinced. What has she shown? Well, she's shown that John thinks Philip is from Bethsaida, but we knew that. And that John may agree with Luke against Mark that the feeding of the 5,000 should take place near Bethsaida. So when you tell the story, you should place it near Bethsaida on the east side of the lake. Okay. She's shown that Mark may confirm that the event should take place in spring. That's assuming it's not a theological detail. That's also assuming that it's not just a wrong detail, because he's from Italy, and green grass is to be expected in Italy, and maybe he doesn't know exactly how things work in the East, and that's why Luke and Matthew get rid of that detail. But again, we're assuming we've been convinced. So Mark may confirm that the event should take place in spring, and that there was a reasonable way to come up with a number of about 5,000 men and accommodate Matthew's women and children. So that's what she has shown. So John thinks Philip is from Bethlehem.
The miracle was multiplied, or the food was. I'm just
yeah. Well, yeah. So first of all, let me draw some connections back. So John agrees with Luke that the thing happened in Bethsaida, and we can find a zigzaggy way of fitting Mark into that. So they agree on the location. That's sort of like Heracles in Euripides agreeing that the skin should be in the eastern Peloponnesus. So we should be on the eastern side of the lake, just like they agree that if you're going to give the skin to a son, he should be on the eastern side of the Peloponnesus. They agree that it should take place in spring, just like, and they indicate that it should happen in spring in different ways,
right?
Just like the various reporters of Vespasian's miracle agreed that this event should happen in spring. And they reported that, they indicated that in various ways. And that there was a reasonable way to come to the number of 5,000 men. So this is a sort of believable detail because we put them in these military formations of hundreds and fifties. Just like, again, the Waynes are always killed in an alleyway. That's a reasonable place to get hit by a mugger. They're not hit at a gala ball and mugged by a guy at a gala ball. That's not a reasonable place to have somebody mugged. So you don't put it there. You put it in somewhere someone's more likely to be mugged, even if it doesn't fit the sort of infrastructure of the city you're talking about. So for me, then I'm worried about cross-contamination. John can get the fact that it's in Bethsaida from Luke. And maybe he's got Luke and Mark in front of him, and he's got to decide between them, and he just chose Luke.
Right.
Because Luke had a stronger indication of where it happened. And he sees that Mark put it in spring, so that maybe gives him an idea, and he puts it just before Passover. I don't know that I would read that much into his shift from anthropoi to androi. He likes variation. But if you really did put in that much work, okay, if he's read Matthew, he knows there are women and children there. So you haven't, for me, eliminated cross-contamination, and that this is just the way you tell this story. And again, like you just mentioned, just because there's a way you tell the story doesn't mean the contentious part, the part that people have trouble with, which is the grand miracle, actually took place.
And I want to flip that for 1 second. I don't want to hog time here because I'm loving this. They don't think Vespasian had the power to do what he did. They don't believe that Asclepius really has powers from God, that he's truly someone of nobility and true, someone that should probably be worshipped. No, they probably would categorize it in fiction. They probably would categorize it in similar categories that I would. It's when you get to this that the fan fiction comes in, but this is not fiction to them. They're wanting to make this real. And so I don't think they're consistent on that. Even if we were somehow convinced on all the arguments, okay, they went to these places, they went into the field, and it was this time of the year, and somehow that's the case. None of that even comes close to convincing anyone, unless you're already drinking the Kool-Aid, I like to call it, that the miracle itself actually happened. Just because you have these places, you can open up any of the fictions in the Greek and Roman world. They're going to place on the Aeolian Islands. Go read Homer, go read Odyssey, these particular texts that I've been mentioning over and over. Read Virgil's Aeneid. They are written contemporaneous about a Caesar Augustus, ultimately about him being that fruition, this particular line of divine men through emperors, the imperial cult, and how this long history going all the way down to the Roman Empire being chosen and Romulus foretelling it, the whole nine. We don't read that and think this is literally what exactly happened in that case. You see what I'm saying? So there's my little
right. So this, I mean, this goes back to, it's fundamentally a circular argument. If you don't award the Gospels a special treatment, then you're not going to come to the same conclusions, or you're not going to be as convinced by her argument. And so since I don't treat the Gospels as if they need special methods and special ways of approaching them, I don't just assume they're reliable on every count, then having these undesigned coincidences and knowing these undesigned coincidences happen in literature that's fantastical outside of the Gospels, to me, it just doesn't say much of anything. It says that other than there's a way you tell this story. In the 40, 50, 60 years since the event, a way of telling this story emerged. And I'm willing to bet that anybody in the audience that's from the US could tell you the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. There's a way you tell that story, and you know the punchline. You know you have to end with, Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. It doesn't mean it actually took place, even though all the figures are historical. All the setting is realistic. He grew up around cherry trees. But even if you had different tellings of the story and they had undesigned coincidences, it doesn't make an argument that that event actually happened, or it just wouldn't convince me that it actually happened. And it's not even fantastical. It's just a sort of story to illustrate that George Washington was always honest. But, so I'm worried about cross-contamination. She sort of treats any unique detail as an independent, reliable tradition that was brought forward into the gospel from the time it happened. And none of these point to the idea that the miracle actually happened.
Right. Even if we granted the whole historical reportage, that's what I'm saying. It's like, let's try to somehow nail this down as if they're granting, let's say, like Allison and others, Bart Ehrman, others that are kind of more on the whole oral memory position of suggesting there's a memory here. Let's just say this memory is reflecting that they went out into this land, and it's not mimesis. It's not to the scriptures, as you pointed out, some prophetic fulfillment of messianic expectation or any of that. This is what actually is going on. That account of the miracle claim does not follow, is my point. Yeah. They want you to go people, places, things, real. Then you get to this thing and it's like, whoa, that's a big pill to swallow. And there's several of those big pills throughout this literature to swallow. Endless pills like that you have to swallow. You give them other accounts. You give them other figures, Vespasian. You give them other gods, demigods, miracle accounts. No, thank you. I'm not swallowing that pill. That's the inconsistency. They might throw, you have a Humean worldview. You have an inconsistent one where you think this is the one and everyone else isn't. And I've said it before. If I became a supernaturalist again, where I opened up that world, I would want to consistently say, hey, based on this criteria, if I think the Gospels are doing this, I think that this other literature is also reflecting the realities of other claims, other gods, other figures. And in some way, I might even go, that's true too. So now I'm like this universalist supernaturalist who thinks gods or God is working through different people and different gods and different avenues and cultures and religions, etc. Like, I'm not going to be inconsistent. That's the problem. My opinion.
There are people who, take that position. And so it's an option. So these are choices, and this is sort of like what I focus on. You're making choices as you go into this, and in this case, you have to choose to very explicitly say this is different. And this is why I say this would appeal to someone who's not terribly familiar with other first century literature. Because if you are familiar with other first century literature, you're going to start asking those questions like, wait, does this not happen elsewhere? And when you see it happen elsewhere, then her original claim, her specific claim about undesigned coincidences, that you will not find these in fictional or fictionalized sources, or at least you won't find many of them, starts to fall apart.
Right.
And if you're not willing to believe that Vespasian healed somebody with spit, then you have to ask yourself the question, why are you willing to believe on these grounds that Jesus did these miraculous things? I mean, if Philip's from Bethsaida, if John thinks Philip's from Bethsaida, and he reads Luke and this thing happens in Bethsaida, well, then, yeah, Philip's going to be my go-to guy.
Right.
And Philip's a real guy, and Bethsaida's a real place. But it's still, it doesn't alleviate the suspicion for me that John has a tendency to specify vague anonymous characters in the synoptics. So where it's an anonymous woman in the synoptics, it's Mary in
But we
John.
also find this in the patristics. They would take characters or elaborate and give them more context. But it's almost like even a Jewish tradition. Look at Enoch. He gets one little glimpse. Next thing you know, you have this fan fiction literature where it just tells you everything about what happened when he went up in heaven. And, this happens. I think it's probably a phenomena that's found in several origins of particular religions where they elaborate on the characters over time, giving them more details and things. And I imagine John might be doing this, but I can't prove that he is. I'm saying, but they can't prove either. So that's the
right. And that's the problem. We're stuck in this state of uncertainty. So there are different ways of explaining the same data. We can go through one model, we can go through another model, we can go through a third model, and we can all end up at the same place. And unless we get more actual data, we're not in a position always to rule out one or the other. And this is, again, one of my fundamental problems here is that the new data is her imagination. So her ability to imagine a historical detail or a historical scenario that gave rise to John and Luke and Mark and Matthew. And if she can do that, she's satisfied that whatever she imagined is what really happened.
Right.
And I mean, it's a risky thing. I mean, I think it's a risky thing for her. It's her religion. She can do as she wants to, but there's always imagination in historical work. So I'm not saying like, oh, she used her imagination, that's bad. But to reify your imagination, to set it in stone is, to risk worshiping something made with human hands. And it's a creation of yours. And so I would be weary of setting it in stone and saying this is now allows me to worship through the Bible in the way I want to. Right. When it's not dependent on the Bible, it's dependent on my imagination.
So not to interrupt, are you, so how as far as slides go, do we have more presentation?
We got one more.
Okay.
And then we can chit chat.
This would be good to have a little bit of small talk after about a few things that I'd like to dive into with you. Then we can get to our super chats and things like that whenever we, because there's so much that I'd like to dig in with you, if that's okay.
Right. So I've been completely ignoring Acts, and I know some people are like, when is he getting to Acts? But I do want to sort of take a broad view again and just say, again, so let's ignore all the fundamental problems that I have. Let's ignore all the questions that I would raise on particular issues. Let us say that we're going to grant that she's made a convincing argument 47 times in a row. So that's what she's done. That every single instance I've been like, yeah, I agree with that. What has she shown overall? Well, she's shown that the Gospels take place in the same basic narrative universe, as long as you ignore the contradictions and the inconsistencies. So she hasn't shown that they are all necessarily historically reliable. What she's shown is that they tell these stories in a way that fits together, even if we grant everything.
Mm-hmm.
But them fitting together doesn't prove that they're reliable. So at least it doesn't convince me that they're reliable. If we turn to, so I've been ignoring poor Paul and Acts, but if we turn to Paul and Acts, so what she does is uses Paul's genuine letters, so the undisputed letters, and uses them to show that Acts is reliable. So she shows agreements between Acts and Paul's letters, and then she can say, well, we know this is genuine, so if Acts agrees with it, Acts must be genuine too, must be reliable. But again, she's showing that they take place in the same basic timeline. So she shows that Acts basically knows Paul's itinerary, has a basic understanding of when certain events took place and where they took place. She thinks this is because of independent information, because Luke was a friend of Paul's.
Mm-hmm.
But again, there's other ways of explaining that. One is Acts knows the letters. And if you say, well, but sometimes it shows things in a distinct way. Yeah, maybe it just doesn't like the way Paul did it. Maybe it doesn't like the way Paul said it. It says it thinks it can do it better, or thinks it should be said differently.
Or disagrees.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's only on the assumption that they have to agree on every point that then those distinct details become an argument for independence. If you don't have that assumption that they have to agree on every point, you can say, I admire Paul. I want to tell you about Paul, but I don't think everything that came out of his mouth was absolutely correct. Then, okay, he knows the timeline of Paul's life. Maybe he knows people who knew Paul. Maybe he knows, that kind of information is easy to come by. What it doesn't prove is that the miracles and visions and things that are associated with Paul necessarily took place. So knowing if I'm going to have a certain story take place, it should be in this place at this time, doesn't say that my story is actually true. Then she uses the genuine letters to prove Acts is reliable. And now we get to a situation where we're sort of stacking hypothesis on top of a hypothesis, because it's already hypothetical that the genuine letters prove Acts as reliable. Now we're going to use the conclusion of that argument that Acts is reliable to prove the disputed letters are reliable.
Right.
So we're stacking things. So this is kind of bad. And again, she's just proving that, like, okay, he basically knows when to put Paul where. Like, these people, whoever wrote the letters, fit with Acts on his placement and the timeline. There's also a bit of a tautological argument here, because there's not a lot of undesigned coincidences in this last section. But she explains that away. So she says, well, Acts ends after he just gets to Rome, but the letters were written after he got to Rome. The disputed letters were written in Rome. So because the timeline doesn't overlap, you wouldn't expect a lot of undesigned coincidences. But that puts you in this awkward position where it's like, okay, if there are a lot, that means that it's reliable. And if there are not a lot, that also means that it's reliable. So that's kind of questionable to sort of explain away the fact that there's not a lot of them. But there are some, and if you're taking the position that if you find any, it's reliable, then that's enough. So she wants a maximalist conclusion. That's where she wants to get. What she demonstrates, even if we grant her everything, is only a minimal reliability. So they basically know where people were at what time. They basically know the geography. They basically know how people behaved, because there's a whole section about like lining the Gospels up with what we know historically about the context. So they can put some verisimilitude in. That's really kind of basic if you're talking about 4 biographies and a short history. Like, you expect them to have that kind of understanding. So I think even if we step back and say, well, if you proved everything in the Acts section, I don't know how far that takes you, other than he's not a complete imbecile. So that's where I ended up. That's where I ended up on this book. Is I don't think the method is, I think it's founded on very shaky grounds. And even if I ignore all those shaky grounds, I don't know that I'm terribly impressed by what it proves, or at least what it seeks to prove, because it wants to prove the miraculous by extrapolation. So if it's reliable about these incidental details, it must be reliable that Jesus is actually the Son of God. And I think that's a big leap.
I'm with you. Sorry about having to turn my camera off for seconds there. So there's a couple things that you did, which I liked, that you were very careful about as we were dissecting the contents and explaining her positions. And that was granting her these ideas. You're granting a lot, by the way, in all these hypothetical, like, get in the sandbox. Let's assume she's correct. Let's assume. And she clearly kind of avoids contradictions. But when in some of those quotes she showed, she like wants to say things like, well, they're kind of explained away easily, a lot of them. As far as your research goes, as far as reading this book, let's take all that granted back. Okay, we granted it hypothetically during the presentation, but I want to take all that back and not grant her. I want to take a critical approach here. I've heard a video before in criticizing apologetics, I like to call it, because many of the people have a Mick in their last name. So it's like Apologist, apologetics, etc. There was a video done by Camille Gregor, which, by the way, you actually know. They've emailed you about doing some publications. And they pointed out she avoids making the undesigned coincidence connections when John talks about Jesus cleansing the temple. He does so twice if you take this approach, because it's a completely different time in which he's cleansing the temple. And why aren't you connecting these two dots? What is this? Is a huge, like, chronological issue. They'll just say, yeah, he cleansed it twice. But in one of the Gospels, it seems he was killed for this, or at least it leads in that direction. The reason Jesus...
Well, I mean, if you're going to keep doing it, Jesus, like, we're going to have to take you out.
Yeah. That was strike 2, man. We're not giving you 3, but after 2, we told you. So historically, is John correct that Jesus cleansed the temple twice if you grant this overlapping, they're actually complementing each other? Oh, there's 2 angels here and there's 1 here. That means there was really 2 angels, even if they only mentioned 1. Well, there were 2 cleansing of the temples because they happened at 2 different times. Did this actually happen historically? These are issues that I would say, discrepancies or problems that you would have if you're trying to do this reportage supposed model. Are there any other ones that stick out, or you might want to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, I mean, with the cleansing of the temple, like, this is a really old problem that's been rejected for hundreds of years. So it's been a method of just saying, well, every time there's the inconsistencies become insurmountable. So if they get too big, we'll just say it happened multiple times.
You broke out. If they get what?
If the inconsistencies get too big, we'll just say it happened multiple times. So if there's minor inconsistencies, we can just say this is their style of talking, or this is what you expect from eyewitness testimony. But if, like with John, like I said, Mark is very rarely temporally located, but the cleansing of the temple is specifically very close to his death. So we know when that happened in Mark. And John is often temporarily located, so we know when the cleansing happened in John, and it doesn't match. So there are other cases where, was he anointed twice? Because Luke's is so different from everybody else's. Did Peter confess that Jesus was the Messiah twice? Because John's version is so different from the synoptic versions. So you start multiplying all these things. And I did a study a while back on the humanist reception of Mary Magdalene. And one of the people in that debate brought this up, that he's like, if you start saying every time two stories are a little different, Jesus is just going to be the most repetitious life in the world. There's a guy named Klichtov, and he was like, everything's going to get doubled up, because it's a matter of what your tolerance is. Unless they have the exact same text, then you're going to be like, well, these are slightly different, so it must have happened multiple times. With the cleansing of the temple, here's something I would point out about the cleansing of the temple. In all four Gospels, the first time that Jesus enters Jerusalem as a public figure, he enters the temple and throws a hissy fit. So that they agree on. What they don't agree on is, when did Jesus enter Jerusalem as a public figure? So there are some John scholars, like Ray Brown, who would say, well, John's got the more realistic case here. Like, the more plausible version is John's.
Right.
That he's probably going back and forth to Jerusalem, and this probably happened a lot earlier. Whereas most synoptic scholars would say anything in John is BS. So, like, anytime John disagrees with the synoptics, that's crap. So it must have been when Mark said. But Mark also has a sort of artificial structure to his gospel. So it's half the gospel in Galilee and performing miracles and saying he's a teacher, but not really giving his teaching. And then half the gospel, he's heading toward his death. So if we know that Mark has a very artificial structure, and it's because of that very artificial structure that John doesn't enter Jerusalem until shortly before his death, that raises suspicion for me about Mark's version. And then John just happens to have him enter Jerusalem earlier. So, and that might be more realistic. But in these terms, yeah, she doesn't look at, like, John cites different scripture in the temple scene. They both happen just before Passover. So there's this other just before Passover thing. So it happens multiple times in John. Like, it's a recurring motif. So the fact that they don't think those are overcomable is a reason to sort of set them to the side. I would be interested to see then creating a timeline of Jesus's life and seeing how often things need to repeat. So do we agree that, like, one says it was a Gadarene demoniac, one says it's a Gerasene demoniac? Are those different things? Do we consider that a different enough thing that we need to have Jesus going across the lake and exorcising a demoniac multiple times in order to accommodate these different location names or these different ethnicities that they apply to them? So those are all over the place, and it's relying on the assumption that they should agree and that they're telling the same story.
Right. Because it's a reported, the assumption is this is a reported eyewitness thing. And even if you find the contradictions, I've heard it said, well, eyewitnesses don't agree on everything, so they're going to get some details maybe off. Therefore, this only proves my case even more that it's eyewitness testimony, Derek. And so I feel like...
So another tautological argument, if they agree, it's reliable witness. If they disagree, it's a reliable witness.
You broke up. Tautological argument.
Oh, so it's again a tautological... Yeah, tautological argument. If they agree, it's reliable witness. And if they disagree, it's a reliable witness. Well, okay, so then it's just reliable witness. Why even depend on the agreements or disagreements?
Right.
You're just going to say it's reliable anyway.
Yes, that's... I'm seeing that. Contradictions are a big problem. I didn't know if any really stuck out to you that made you go, I really feel like this nails the whole thing shut. But I imagine there's other layers to this and how we might approach this. And that is, they're not... So I'm taking the outside view. We're not doing fan fiction anymore. I'm hoping we can criticize here just the whole picture. And that is factoring in literary approaches and understanding literature as a significant proponent to this idea of what are the Gospels? What are they doing? Is this legend? Is there other examples of literature we can look to, correlating from that and being able to say, hey, this looks like that. This looks like it's doing something this other literature is doing. So we should factor this into our model to understand what the Gospels are doing. That is, if you want to argue they're theological, I would say that the fine line between literary and theology is kind of there. It's a blurred thing because they're pulling back from Scripture. They're modeling Jesus after Elijah, Jonah, Elisha, Moses. In modeling him, it looks like the author is doing this, not that this is a reportage of what's actually happening. I would go further even to say, especially since this is a Judeo-Christian or even Jew and Gentile movement, they're going to do the same with heroes from the Roman and Greek world, the Caesars, giving him titles for the whole nine. So what do you see that would do if you start bringing in some of this to the conversation?
Well, first, I mean, one thing I just want to note is you bring up a common argument, and you see this a lot even in biblical studies, especially when they're trying to argue for reliability, the so dumb they're reliable argument, which is like, if you start bringing up literature, some people will then dismiss it because they're looking at the literature and saying, well, that's sort of above the disciples' pay grade. All they're doing, they have no creativity. They have no mental input to this whatsoever. All they're doing is reporting. And there's just so much evidence against that. There's so many literary elements, even to Mark. So Mark was the poster child of this. Mark was like, oh, that's why none of his anecdotes fit together, because he's just like, this happened and this happened and this happened.
Right. And then
then you start to notice these motifs, like the hidden Messiah, and you start to notice this artificial plot structure, like Galilee to Jerusalem. And it's like, oh no, he's doing stuff. You may like it or not, but he's doing stuff. I think so Craig Keener writes the foreword for McGrew's book. And Keener's a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant. I think if I ever had a conversation with him, I've never met him in person, but if I ever had a conversation with him, I imagine I would just start seeing his head expand like the leader from the Hulk. Just such a huge knowledge of Greco-Roman literature, of early Jewish literature. So very smart guy, but I've never seen him take a position that wouldn't get him a pat on the back in this church. I don't know if that's just because that's where the evidence led him and that's just how it happened, or his personal adherence to a church is sort of keeping reins on him.
Right.
But he wrote a book called Christobiography, which I reviewed. And I think that's why they sort of chose him to be the forward. So it's making the argument that the Gospels are reliable, and he does this based on comparisons to other contemporary biographies. So he makes a strong argument that they're biographies, and they're a certain type of biography, and then he makes the additional argument that that means to the audience they would expect a reliable narrative. That he doesn't go so far as to say, therefore they are reliable. Just that the audience expects a reliable narrative because of the genre they're in. And yet, the one thing I took him to task for is he sort of dismisses John, as historical Jesus people are likely want to do. He sort of puts John to the side because he's like, well, John's just sort of doing theological stuff. And so John disagrees with the other ones because he's just doing theological stuff and he's being creative. And it's like, but he fits all the criteria you just said for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's written within living memory of the historical figure. He has all these other characteristics that you use to argue that people would expect a reliable story. So if he's just being creative, then one of your 4 examples is giving you something unreliable and yet hitting all of these genre markers. So I think he's got the right idea in that if we start looking at biographies, what are they doing? And what he differentiates, he says, well, within living memory is one type of biography, because he wants to get rid of the biographies of like Alexander the Great.
Right.
And Alexander the Great's biographies are having him perform miracles and having a miraculous birth. Alexander the Great's birth looks very much like Jesus's birth in Matthew and Luke. So I want to put those to the side because I don't believe that. And I don't want to deal with miracles and stuff like this. So I want to look at lives of Otho because I have multiple lives of Otho and I can do a comparison. I think if we genuinely, though, go down that track, I think he's sort of on the right track in that we want to look at, first of all, biographies because that's what the Gospels are. They fit all the genre conventions of a biography. Then we want to expand and say, well, they're written at a certain sort of educational level, a certain popular level. And the closest thing there then is the novels. Not to say that they're novels, but they're written at that level. And what can we learn from the novels? What kind of similar scenes show up in the novels that are contemporary with the Gospels? They're written in Koine. They have very similar structures to them, similar use of dialogue, similar use of anecdotes, like structurally very similar, but the assumption is they're fictional. Okay, but how are they destructuring their plots? How are they characterizing people? How are they using miracles? Things like shipwrecks, and the shipwreck is a standard part of the novels. And then you read the end of Acts, and it's like, yeah, I've seen that before. Mm-hmm. So how are they using? How might they have been influenced by this? The thing I would think of is like Star Wars. If you look at Star Wars, yeah, it's a sci-fi movie, but it's clearly based on Kurosawa. And it's clearly based on these like sort of Japanese movies that are set in a very different time period and stuff, but it's taking inspiration from them. So can we do the same with the Gospels and the novels? Can we do the same with the Gospels and very popular epics like Homer or Virgil, like you've mentioned? What would be in the cultural milieu?
Right.
And that's what I try to do and what I do. And so when I did like my book on direct internal quotations, like I combed through and tried to find, where do you see a lot of these things? Well, one place you see a lot of them is in forensic speeches. So you can go to, Socrates' Apology, and you find a lot of direct internal quotations because it's testimony and you want to interrogate somebody else's testimony. You quote them to say, why did you say this? And then that opened a lot of, even though John's not forensic literature, John's not a forensic speech, but it opened up a lot of venues to say, well, he's doing something very similar with his internal quotation. So is he familiar with this kind of forensic rhetoric and how to use somebody else's speech against them? So that's where I would go, is look at what they're doing and be open to the possibility that somebody like Matthew, if you read Matthew's birth story, it looks like a standard Greco-Roman birth story.
Right.
It's got all the elements. If you read Heracles, we're back. Heracles, if you read his birth narratives, what happens? Well, the baby has a divine father and a human mother, and there's a threat of divorce because the human father is not happy that his wife's been knocked up and it's not his. And then the baby's born and it's immediately put in danger and it has to be saved by a miracle. And I mean, there's just element after element after element. He's a fantastic learner, so that he learns the virtues as a prodigy, as a young man, just like Jesus goes to the temple at 12 in Luke. And so you then have to make a choice. Is this relevant? Do I think this is relevant? I don't think somebody like McGrew is going to make that choice. I don't think she's going to say, yes, I think this is relevant. But every one of us has to make that choice and say, this is very similar. I can see a lot of similarities here. Should I be reading this to understand the Gospels better? And let me test that hypothesis. If I test it against this, do I seem like I come to a deeper understanding of the Gospels?
I love this. Everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me. We would do it with any other piece of literature.
Mm-hmm.
And like we always get the accusation for people who are critical of this text or this material is that, well, you don't treat the other material that way. Yes, we do. Yes, I do. And that's why I fall down with the conclusion I do. Like, I'm like, yeah, Heracles is legend. Most likely I'd even go as far if we wanted to say legends built around a historical person.
Right.
I tend to think he probably never existed. And if he did, it's so archaic. He was probably some hero in battle and they turned him into something. And we've lost him completely to history. And he is only known through myth or legend. And I'm looking at Jesus. I see those characteristics. So at the end of the day, if I took the apologist view, the undesigned coincidence view, the reportage model, and then I saw all the questions, all the discrepancies, all the other issues, and I factored them in on the table. And at the end of the day, we said, you know what? Let's not be dogmatic one way or the other. Let's say there could be some blend of memory, potential word of mouth, this spread to this person that got there, and that's how they know this guy's from this region or whatever. Let's give some, but I would imagine if they're reasonable, which I don't think it's going to happen, there's some give and pull here. And they might go, well, I'm going to go so far as to say that I think that there's some legend in here. We're gonna do this birth narrative in Matthew fairly. I was just reading yesterday, somewhat contemporaneous, Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, and Augustus' birth. Like, he not only has portents, not only is he somebody divine who's going to come as kind of a king. Here's Jesus as a king, rank Raglan kind of hero model here, but then goes even a step further to say that the Senate that year said no children should be reared up. Well, hold on. I think I've heard this before. So therefore, because I look at all this, there's a lot of people, places, and things that are historically there. There's mention of wars. There's a huge biography from Suetonius about Augustus and all the other Caesars that are mentioned. Therefore, this guy really did have a divine birth, and we should start drawing these conclusions. Maybe they were the real ones. Maybe we got duped. Maybe, maybe these are the ones that deserved our worship. I'm being silly here, but that
should just all be pious Romans,
right? That what you're saying though, looking at the material, they'll say biography because it fits a biography style in many ways. Even though there are some scholars who would say like biography mostly, and I know this isn't universal because the categories are kind of gray in some ways, is like usually cradle to grave. We have that in Matthew and Luke. We don't have that in John. We don't have that in Mark. So it's in a weird way, it's like somewhat modeling biography, but then in other ways you say there's novel type ideas, there's literary tropes that come in and that are clearly fictional, embellishing that character to legendize them and such. This is where I'm at. And I didn't come here because I wanted it not to be true. This is me being really evenly fair across the materials. And that's why I think Craig Keener's probably brilliant and knows so much. And I don't understand what goes on to make the persons make the conclusions they do. And that's where I get in trouble, because then I start psychoanalyzing and going, what is the real motivation here? It can't be strictly evidence-based. There's got to be something else going on.
Well, there's and I would say this more about McGrew than Keener, but that's why I talk about it as a devotional activity. So there's all sorts of devotional activities. You can pray, you can go to church, you can do charity, you can, there's all sorts of things you can do as a devotional activity. And they're all meant to be things that behaviors you engage in that strengthen your belief and edify your relationship with your religion. Mm-hmm. And your inclusion in the group. And this sort of apologetic analysis of the Bible does all those things. It's successful in that regard. So she's engaging with her Bible, which from her religious perspective is exactly what she should be doing. She's strengthening other people's belief. There are a lot of people who have probably read this book, done it as as a church book group, and then come away with stronger belief in the reliability of the Gospels, which then allows them to pursue their own beliefs in what the Gospels are making claims about even more strongly. So as a devotional activity, I have no problem with it. It does all the things it's supposed to be doing. When you start trying to go into the historical realm, then you can slip into certain bad methods or bad ways of thinking. One thing that I also took Keener to task for. So again, I respect the hell out of Keener, but one thing I took him to task for is this sort of, if it could be, it must be reasoning. So he has a whole section on memory in Christobiography, and he brings up these stories from the ancient world where people would perform these incredible feats of memory, and therefore he'd be like, therefore it was possible that the disciples also memorized all these events and all these teachings and passed them on reliably, and therefore they did that. And it's like, well, sure, it's possible. Like, one of them could have been a prodigy, but let's keep in mind what even the Gospels portray the disciples doing. The disciples are not portrayed as being chosen for their keen intellect. They're being chosen because they're willing to follow Jesus. In the synoptics, which he finds to be more reliable, they hang out with him for about a year. And that off and on, because it's explicit that they're sent away at certain points. And we're not clear how long they were sent away. So it's sort of like saying, yes, there are brilliant college students in the US, absolutely brilliant college students. But if I pick 12 random college students, send them to school for a year off and on, and then 40 years later ask them to recall what they learned in school, am I reasonably going to expect that they're going to give me like a whole lecture on physics and be 100% correct, or even close to 100% correct? Like, I don't expect 12 random people who went to school for a year off and on to be that good at memorizing or remembering what they learned. And especially because in the Gospels, we're consistently shown the disciples not believing that there's any reason to need to memorize this.
Right.
Because anytime Jesus is like, dude, I'm going to die, they're like, no, you're not. Shut up. And so if that's your case, if that's your perspective, why do you need to memorize it? Like, Jesus is always around to be like, I can say something, and he'd be like, that's not what I said.
It's almost like the way we've been talking about fan fiction wants you to be in the universe, and the answer needs to be in the universe. And then you start factoring in what's the author want. This understanding of them needing to memorize is the evidence. It's like this, the breaking the fourth wall again, going into the modern person who needs that memory to go back. And it's not a modern thing. The patristic fictional inventions, I think, of my clout, my lineage goes back to Peter, there's reason they do this to give themselves pedigree. But I imagine that's that modern apologetic kind of, this needs to be trustworthy and reliable. And I think it was Paul Tillich that said, or someone to that effect that said, why is the apologist on the warpath? He's on a war with himself, wanting to convince themselves that what they're believing is what they're trying to argue for. And I can relate with that as one who was an apologist, that I'm trying to make sure, I mean, watching Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, these guys for all the years that I did, was trying to make sure that like what I believe is true. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm trying to actually change the world and convince others like Frank Turek, other people. And that's what these apologists are doing. So while I get, hey, here's faith, devotional literature to like get you in your little group, like, yay, we believe these things and it gives us encouragement to think these things are true. That's not what they're doing with it. They're trying to enter the arena of scholarship with this and argue, at least among Christians. I don't think anyone in more of a secular environment is going to take these kind of arguments in this book seriously. And this is what they've seen. They've seen most people are just like, even you didn't even know about it till I brought it to your attention. So is there anything else pertaining to these arguments or even the book that you'd like to make comments on?
No, I think we're good. I think we can start taking some questions.
Okay. I just figured I'd ask because it's a rabbit trail, man. It's there's a lot. So
I will bring, you were saying like the memory back to the patristics. Interestingly enough, some patristic writers at least had the spirit. So they almost could admit that the disciples were unlikely to memorize that, but they had the spirit to remind them, because you can base that on John.
Right.
John has, what will the paraclete do? He'll remind you of what I said. So they were more likely to rely on that and say, well, yeah, the reason John remembers this 50, 60 years later so clearly is because the paraclete is reminding him.
Right.
But I don't see that argument a lot today. So that's just an interesting, discrepancy between those older patristic arguments and like today's arguments.
Yeah. The other patristic one that gets brought up by Richard Miller is modern apologists don't even agree with like Justin Martyr's approach or others. They had pagan temples in their backyards. I'm using pagan as in non-Christian, non-Jewish, but they had these gods that we're talking about that have similar birth narratives in the whole nine. And here's Justin Martyr saying, look, we believe nothing different when it comes to like Hercules, and he lists all these demigods and other figures from the Greek and Roman world, Castor and Pollux, the, various figures. And then goes, of course, thinks Jesus is the one, the true one, but like it's very similar. And like we're in agreement on these things. This is the true one, though. This is like the ultimate. My guy, he's the one. Modern apologists aren't doing that. And I think that's one of the things that got me initially going, hold on. Heracles, there's so much in common with Heracles. We know we put this guy in like fictional categories, but we get to Jesus. And this really screwed me up because I wanted to follow what the facts were. And I saw some problems with the comparison that I saw. There's too much in common. for me to go, what the heck? And this was that argument I had from someone on Twitter last night that said, yeah, well, there was science fiction about us going to the moon. And then now the day that we have gone to the moon, you're going to say it didn't happen. So the argument is all this fiction for millennia, as far back as predating writing, but Sumerian civilization, Egyptian mythology, with the dying agricultural and rising Osiris and the myths that they had, those stories, yeah, they're all fiction. But then you get down, and by the way, that would be a slap in the face probably to many of these cultures and their particular believers. Then you get down to Jesus, and you find elements of all this fiction right here in the New Testament. This one happened. Then everything after that.
You find those things because demons told those people those stories.
Right.
I mean, if we're going to bring in Justin Martyr,
right,
like that's why those stories exist, because I mean, he is making the argument you're talking about, where it's like, we're not that ridiculous. You believe some of the same crazy crap too.
Right.
But here's why ours is true: is demons planted these stories to undermine belief in Jesus once he came, because they understood the messianic predictions. Now we have a version of that today where the devil put the dinosaur bones in the rocks. So we still have the same types of arguments. It's just they're not as threatened by Heracles, because Heracles is not as big a part of our culture anymore.
Right.
Whereas if you're going to science class and you're learning about geology, and that's just a standard 9th grade class, then that's something we need to combat. So we're going to take this tactic out of our bag that we used to use on Heracles, and now we'll use it on dinosaur bones.
Right.
But yeah, it's you, and I don't know. I mean, some people might be might have been more willing to believe that the Osiris didn't really happen.
I'm sure there was
in the same way that there are Christians today, many Christians, who, if you're like, well, it probably didn't happen. Like if you take some element of Jesus's life in the Gospels and you say, well, I mean, it probably didn't happen. This is what theologically they're doing with it. They're perfectly fine with that. I have conversations with Christians all the time like that, where I'm just like, well, here's the reason, like, say Matthew's birth narrative. It's like, it's kind of a standard thing. And you have these elements, and he just sort of Judaizes them and applies them to Jesus. They're like, oh, okay, that's cool. Like, what's the message? Because that was the important thing. So it's not whether Osiris died and we saved everything but his penis or whatever. It's what is the truth behind that story.
Right.
And so there are many Christians today who are perfectly comfortable approaching the specific details of Jesus's life in the same way. Now, they may be like, I definitely think he had to be the Son of God. I definitely think he had to be resurrected.
Right.
But everything else is sort of like, what truth about him are you trying to communicate to me? And I'm okay with that. So it is worth always pointing out that this sort of historicistic fundamentalism is a sort of distinct quality of a certain smaller group of Christians. It's not universal among Christianity. And there are many Christians, many millions of Christians, who, when they see this sort of nitpicking over details and fighting over maximalism versus minimalism and all that, or minimal facts and maximal facts,
right.
They think it's kind of silly. And they just go about their day because they're like, look, I have my faith. And I understand that these were people writing these gospels, and they were doing the best they could. And if they had to, if they got a little indulgent in one place, that's okay, as long as reading it, you believe a little better. And the thing is, like, you read John, and that's his mission statement. I wrote these things so you would believe.
Right.
He doesn't say, I wrote these things so that you would have an accurate record of the events. So, it's to an extent, like all these sort of discussions is for a particular type of Christian.
I love what you said. I can find meaning and value and lessons, not only in the New Testament, but elsewhere too. And there's some great stories out there that convey what we would call truths, wisdoms, proverbs, things that are lessons, because I think we can relate to them. And that was the question my mom had one day, was like, son, she never asked again after this, but she said, why don't you believe in Jesus anymore? And I knew that the kind of Christianity I came from and the kind of Christian my mom is, I know mom quite well. I said, let me tell you a story from the Greek world. And I just gave her like this really interesting beginning to end story of the Odyssey, as we have it, of course, and Odysseus' story. She could relate because my dad, her husband, is a retired Green Beret in the Special Forces. So he's a war hero. He was a medic, Halo instructor, the whole nine, like the guy, credentials, the whole nine. And he was kind of like, I related it in a way and conveying it to her that Odysseus had to go to war. He had to go to war to protect his homeland, his people. And so he goes. And the whole story is this love story in a way where he can't wait to get back, no matter what happens. A goddess takes him, Calypso Island, the various stories and journeys and trials and all this. He comes back. The lessons about the delayed recognition and hiding his identity, all this stuff that I see Mark doing, in my opinion. And I'm going through the story. My mom starts crying. She just starts crying because it's deep. It's relatable. It's passionate. It's got lesson in it. It's got love in it. It's got all this stuff. But she just goes, what happens? And I'm like, finally, he makes it home. He gets to his wife. He reveals who he is. He this long journey, and he makes it. He reveals to his dad, Laertes. He reveals to Telemachus. And so I tell her the whole story. And my mom's like, that was deep. And I was like, that was practically like the religion in literature in a way for the Greeks for so long. It was their holy canonical text of their stories. And this was sacred to them. I said, well, the Gospels are like that to Christians. And so do you understand why that matters to them? I said, so I'm backing up now. I'm not in this little bubble. I'm backing up saying I'll find value where I find value. I don't want your dogma. I don't want your bubble. I want to be able to be this kind of person who can explore, kind of traverse all the worlds like Hermes. I want to be able to go wherever and experience it. I don't want the dogma of atheist group thinking either. I don't want to go, we must be, no, you're going to see some of that maybe in me because I'm combating nonsense a lot, but you get what I'm trying to do. And that's been my goal and trying to get better at it over time. But anyway, so super chats. Camille Gregor, thank you for the super chat at the beginning. Dr. Tripp, that paper I sent you to read is going to be published in the next issue of the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. Thanks again for your help.
Well, congratulations.
Looking forward to it.
That's a good journal. So congratulations. I'm glad you're working on it.
Thank you, Camille, for the super chat. Appreciate the support, the love. Imnag with a super sticker. Thank you so much. I didn't see a comment. Maybe I need to scroll up in this long chat because we've been hanging out for almost 3 hours. But we do this. This is how it is. You are methodical. You and Steve Mason are like the very careful. I'm going to go through and nitpick it. And by the way, I just figured I'd tell you, I had to block him from the chat because he's trolling. But one of the apologists came in here and said, this is the worst presentation I've ever seen on the undesigned coincidences. I'm just not. I can't. I try to be friends. I try to be cool. Like it's become trollish.
Well, there's an accomplishment. I've produced the worst one.
That's good on you. Imnag, I didn't see. You did put a. I don't know if this is to mean an alarm or something. You gave a thumbs up.
He's like, roll it along, man.
Right?
Get to the point.
Just get it. The Laughing Philosopher. Thank you for the super chat. The literary dependence and mythological reworking is so obvious. Looking for independence and reliability in minutia smacks of not seeing the wood for the trees.
So he throws her accusation back at her.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, there is, there's a lot of nitpicking over details, but as somebody who does what I do, nitpicking over details is perfectly okay with me. But yeah, just in looking for independence and reliability, the independence is simply assumed whenever convenient. And then looking for reliability, there are better ways to go about it. There are more historically reliable ways to go about it. So I have no problem with somebody saying, here's the reasons I find it reliable, and I'm going to make an argument for it. Just like I have no problem with somebody saying, here are the reasons I think this is unreliable, that this is based on literary issues or theological issues or whatever, or visionary issues. I mean, there's, we don't talk about this a lot, but there's the issue that Jesus could prophetically speak through people in that early age. Like, we have evidence of people believing that. So the teachings that you see in the Gospels did he say that when he was a person in Galilee, or was that revealed by the risen Christ at a later time, and we've just retroactively put it into his historical life? But there might be any number of arguments against the historical reliability of something, and I think we should be engaging in both of those for the same reason I said with a trial. Like, I don't want a trial without a prosecutor,
Right.
and I don't want a trial without a defense attorney. Like, either way, if you're missing either one of those, you're going to miss some truth. So you want people making their cases, but I just want it done on a historically reliable basis.
That's such an interesting point you bring up of anachronistically putting back into Jesus' mouth, especially when you have them say the Spirit will lead you or teach you at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, has risen Christ teachings he's getting. And I don't think we open the door potentially of exploring that phenomena, especially when you have visionary type literature like Enoch, and Jews were in this, but it wasn't just Jews, the Sibyls. I mean, you're dealing with Greek ideas of visionary, ecstatic experiences, going into trances, glossolalia, speaking in tongues, like all of this stuff starts to factor into this potentially charismatic, as we would call it today, phenomena in early movements where they're having gods and demons and angels and all this stuff floating in their brains. So.
And I'm a John guy, so the gods and things who often pop in and introduce themselves with these I am statements. And so there's been more than a few John scholars who will point to John's I am statements, Jesus's I am statements in John, as a similar phenomenon. And then he talks about how Jesus will send an advocate to speak for him at a later day. Well, how is he going to speak? He's going to speak through prophets. And then it becomes, and what is he going to do? He's going to remind you of what I said. So this is in part why I point out in my book on direct internal quotations that you have these quotations, they're often incorrect. That doesn't mean they're wrong or considered wrong by John. So you have Jesus quoting himself, but misquoting himself. He doesn't quote himself exactly. He changes it to the current situation. And so then you introduce this possibility that you have so many quotations because they are a prophetic community who is receiving messages from Jesus and therefore can introduce modifications, and it's justified because, well, he said that, but in this context, this would be more appropriate, and Jesus told me that.
Right. You know, I got stumbled just one point, and then let's move to the next one. Is that I got tripped up when I was reading Second Peter, and the part where it talks about there'll be mockers and scoffers, that the prophets spoke in past days. And I always thought that meant prophets, you know, immediately Elijah comes to mind, or Isaiah. And I'm like, no, actually, in the early Christian communities, even into the second century, they viewed these early voices as prophets. And Paul thought himself a prophet. So I'm going, oh, I'm thinking it's just talking about these old LXX Hebrew Bible prophets. No, the early Christian community, they prophesied. It even talks about, we'll prophesy until that which is perfect comes in Paul's letter. So they're prophesying, speaking in tongues, the whole nine. So it was just, I had heard it, but never really thought about that. Didn't think that through and how that fits into what you just said. So Maximus, thank you for the super chat. I only subscribe to 3 YouTube channels. This is one of them. Massive cheers to the growth of this brilliant channel. My friend, thank you. That means
That's a good channel.
I'm probably 3rd from the top, but I'll take it. I'm not going to argue. Maximus, thanks. Doc Pluralmanot, thank you for that big super chat, my friend. As the Legio 10, is it constructed you might want to read this.
And Jupiter Venus was now venerated. Can we dismiss the influence pagan Jerusalem had on foreign gospel writers and their ability to accurately tell the Jewish past? So we seem to be pointing to the late date of the Gospels, and then that's a disputed issue of how late are the Gospels and how late is so Jerusalem's destroyed, and we rebuild it under pagan influence. I mean, that really comes to fruition after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. But we do have some pagan worship introduced. Can we dismiss the influence pagan Jerusalem had on foreign gospel writers? And so I don't think we can dismiss it. There is a question of, were they in Jerusalem at those times, or were they dispersed? I think most historical reconstructions of where the gospel writers were would not place them in or near Jerusalem. Maybe Matthew, but even Matthew not in Jerusalem, there's very few that would place him in Jerusalem. They would put him up in Antioch in Syria, or somewhere even farther up. I guess Caesarea Maritima is pretty close, but they are dispersed to other places. So I don't know how much what's going on in Jerusalem is going to be relevant, but Antioch is not a primarily Jewish city. Ephesus, if that's where you think John wrote, is not a primarily Jewish city. Philippi, if that's where you think Luke wrote. Rome, if that's where you think Mark wrote. Like, they're living in a sort of diaspora situation, even if you take the sort of majority view on this. And they're exposed to these myths. They're exposed to these festivals. They're exposed to these other beliefs. Like, it's just in their milieu. So when you have Christian communities, that's all swell that they get together on Sunday. But the rest of the week, they are working for families that aren't Christian. They are working, or they have workers in their house that aren't Christian. There is criticism of Christians who participate in festivals to other gods. And because there's criticism, the tendency is, well, then, that was normative. Christians didn't do that. But then who are you criticizing? Evidently, there were Christians who were still sacrificing to other gods and participating in these other festivals. That means they need to learn a liturgy. Often they would need to learn songs. They would need to learn stories in order to be able to perform what they need to do in the context of that festival. So, yeah, they're very familiar with these other cultures. Now, could they accurately retell the Jewish past? They could, to an extent. And so there's, are they Jewish? If John grew up in Jerusalem, if the author of John grew up in Jerusalem, lived there until, say 40, and then left, well, he still spent like 20, 30 years there. I could tell stories about Detroit in the 90s. I haven't lived in Detroit in decades, right. but I could do it. But there are going to be things I get wrong. And even now I have internet to check and I would still get some stuff wrong.
One question on that, and I don't want to derail you, but I have not done a deep investigative, like at some point I imagine I'll need to, but as far as the scholarship goes, do they get things wrong? They always like to point out they got this person, this place, this thing correct, and accurate. Do the Gospels get ideas about people, places, and things wrong? I know they get the census in Luke. There's things like that, but I'm saying, can you think of other things that are clear, geographic issues, regional problems, things like that scholars have written on that you're convinced of?
Yeah, I mean, especially so. I think connecting with this question. So you look at Luke, and Luke has kind of a few of them. So he doesn't quite get what happens at circumcision, right? When he narrates Jesus' circumcision. So like the way he presents the cleansing isn't quite on with what we know about that from other sources. So there's little things that he gets a little off. Mark miscites scripture and credits it to the wrong author. So it'll be like, oh, Isaiah said this. No, he didn't. So there are elements like that. So these are directly relevant to their knowledge of Judaism and the Judaism practiced in, say, the 30s. And yet they get these elements wrong. So in most cases, it's difficult to say. We just wouldn't be in a position to say whether they're right or wrong.
Right.
But it's possible they get things wrong because they don't know any better. And it's also possible they get things wrong because they're just being creative and they're just like, well, this would make more sense.
They might have another agenda
So Mark messes up on his roofs. So when they lower a guy through the roof in Mark, and the way he describes it looks like an Italian house. And because that's the kind of house he knows. And then Matthew and Mark change it because they know more what the architecture in the Middle East looks like. So they make it more appropriate. So they just tweak his vocabulary a little. But, so then is that important? Is that important that he's like picturing a tiled Mediterranean house and that's not what they had in Galilee?
If you needed to be reportage of what actually happened, I guess, like.
So, I mean, what I think McGrew would say is like, well, if I said he blew through the stoplight and, I'm telling you what somebody did and he blew through the stoplight and really at that intersection, there's a stop sign. So he did endanger people. He did blow through something he shouldn't have blown through. I got it right that there was a traffic violation, but I slightly misremembered what the actual traffic regulations were at that intersection. Then I could still be considered reliable.
Thank you. Last one here. We had pop in last minute. Michael Apple says, I think the undesigned coincidence is found in between the Bolkansky, Bezukov, Mishkin, Raskolnikov, and Karamazov families indicates a deeper historical truth. No way this is fiction. Great discussion. I don't even know these names.
So like the brothers Karamazov is one of the great Russian novels. And so if you have these coincidences between these Russian families, then so I mean, this is it speaks to the whole issue, the fundamental issue with her method, at least as it's presented in this book. So I don't know if she revises it in other books or anything, but at least as it's presented in this book, she is making the claim that you will not find these in fictional or fictionalized literature or in legendary literature. So we keep finding them in the fiction, what we consider fictional or fictionalized literature. Now, these novels are grounded historically. They reflect the historical realities, but that doesn't mean any Karamazovs existed. They're a complete fabrication. So it's Dostoevsky. I was not blanking. I kept thinking Tolstoy, but it's not Tolstoy. So that if that's the basis of what you're doing, is the assumption that if you find undesigned coincidences, it therefore means that this is reliable because you will not find them in any other type of literature. It's just easily falsifiable.
Someone snuck in another 20. I can't turn down money, but they said, I often think if Jesus was real, there are many things in the Torah he would be forced to fix. Flat Earth, Egypt, Canaan, slavery. In your perspective, what is the biggest tell rooted in the Hebrew Bible that he wasn't Yahweh's kid?
Well, arguably he does fix stuff. So right now I'm preparing a video on biblical marriage. And in between the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, you see a shift toward monogamy. And historically, what happened is the Greeks came in. The Greeks took over. And Greeks only legally recognized one marriage at a time. Now, Jesus officially recognizes only one marriage at a time. So, arguably, he fixed that bit of the Mosaic law, because the Mosaic law recognizes that you can have multiple wives at the same time. So then you get into this issue of like, did he... What you got there?
Cattell Berthelot?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you read it. It literally goes into exactly how the Greeks and Romans influenced pre-Christian Rome, of course, influenced Jews and stuff, but also Greeks and stuff. But it's really cool.
Oh yeah, I mean it's incontestable that monogamy doesn't come from Yahweh. It comes from, say, Zeus and Hera. Like, it comes from the Greek West. And by that time, it's the norm. And so in Enoch, monogamy is criticized. It's vilified. But by the time you get to the New Testament, it's standard. So you have these, you have this gap, and Jesus corrects that. Or, in some of his teachings as presented in the Gospels, if you're not allowed to remarry after a divorce, or it's considered adultery, it's probably bad that if you marry a second woman while you're still married to the first woman. But then it's like, does Jesus disagree with these things? So Greeks would have known, educated people would have known the earth wasn't flat. But does Jesus disagree? I'm not sure what Egypt and Canaan mean in this context, but like slavery, he doesn't free slaves, and that's a rough thing. He doesn't free slaves. He doesn't speak against slavery. Arguably, and now we can get into all sorts of American arguments from the 1800s.
Yeah.
Arguably, him behaving like a slave when he does the foot washing is a way of getting you to sympathize with slaves, enslaved people. So there are these sort of subtle underminings of slavery, but never anything explicit. And it may just be that we disagree with Jesus on that. That, like, if I'm against slavery and Jesus isn't, then that would just be a point where we disagree.
Yeah, and I get the problem if you think this just it's like the same issue with fundamentalists in Islam that are like hell bent on living that 7th century life and following and modeling everything after what Muhammad said. He's the best example we should follow and do what he did, and all that. It's like, well, people model themselves after Jesus. If Jesus was this way, I should be this way. If Jesus thought this, I should think that. And it's like, I appreciate cherry pickers. I'll put it that way.
Well, and you have examples where people are like, oh, I'm living, a biblical life. And then you say, well, are you refusing? Did you cancel all your credit cards? Did you get rid of your mortgage? Because there's 17 different texts in the Bible that forbid charging interest on a loan. So if you have a savings account, you are violating that. And these people are qualified as just like the worst of the worst. Anybody would charge interest on a loan is like, Jeremiah has something, I think it's Jeremiah, where he's like, his life is going horrible. He's probably buried up to his neck in poop. And he's like, what did I do? Did I kill someone? Did I charge interest on a loan? I don't deserve this. and everybody cherry picks. That's it. Nobody's washing feet.
Exactly. Constellation Pegasus says 1914 was a coincidence and failed twice. So Jehovah's Witness background. But thank you, Dr. Tripp, for all your time. Thank you for all the super chats, everybody. I hope you learned a thing or two and got to take a deep dive. We literally tried to immerse ourselves by granting much of the material there. At the end of the day, might be interesting. She might be right about certain things going back to a historical memory at best. I'd say at best, that there could be a memory here, but just the whole overall thing, I think, failed in terms of it being the best explanation.
I mean, McClatchy disagrees, but
right. His opinion matters to 4 people on planet Earth, but it is what it is. There's my jab back. I had to jab back, but I can't. I'm not going to go into the personalities, but like some people are obnoxious and just keeping it real with you. So I really appreciate you, Dr. Tripp. If we can do something here again in the future, I am always open to this because you cover and have dissected Bauckham stuff and really looked into a lot of this detail argumentation that comes from some of these scholars. And you walk out very balanced. You're very fair. I appreciate that. I'm more direct and like, but we can learn a thing or two from you. So please come back.
All right.
Appreciate that. Everybody hit the like button. Show us some love. Like I said, I got to refresh your YouTube here. We're going to see. Remember at the beginning of this, I said, if we don't get 500 subscribers for his YouTube channel, I'm going to have to tell you, I love you, but eternal conscious torment, literally. Like, I'm going to just have to go ahead and pull the plug and it's going to be agonizing. If you've read Dante, it's worse than that. So you get, let's not end up there. Let's get to 500 subscribers right now, putting this in the chat, because I really don't want to see people go there. I mean, I created the place, but just hear me out. Just give me a chance to explain. I did it because I love you. Okay. I love you. And here it is. Subscribe right now. I'm going to count 10. We're going to do an apocalyptic countdown from 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. If we're not at 5, who wants to go to? You don't want to go there. Hit it now. See what happens. Oh my God. Tell me that's not true.
Hey, it's an improvement for me, man.
Oh my gosh. We got 2 more. We're all going to hell, dude.
Me and my 3 buddies on YouTube.
This can't be right.
But yeah, I mean, don't need to subscribe, but check out. I'm rather proud of the series I did on gender. It's breaking down a public lecture I did here in Rockford. I did a few on abortion, as that was all becoming a big issue. So, what I focus on in my videos is how people read, the choices they need to make in order to get to the readings that they have. So if you want to make an argument that the Bible condemns gay people, fine, but these are the choices you have to make in order to get there. So that's what I focus on.
Well, I hope people will subscribe. I'm shocked. I am shocked, but it'll happen over the next day while this video is being viewed. I'm not happy right now, but I added a little fine print to this. Within 24 hours. See, I didn't tell you that up front. And so we have time, but we only have 24 hours. Hallelujah. Go check out the books if you can afford them on Amazon and you really want a scholarly work, because this is going to be scholarly, I'm sure. Imagine you get down into some Greek and stuff as well.
Yeah.
Dr. Tripp, thank you again. Let's close out here. Final words from you. Any encouragement, anything?
I think if anybody's here that is attracted to this sort of apologetic argument, I hope that you didn't feel I was attacking you. I hope you don't feel that I was accusing her of being deceptive or anything like that. I think we have different aims,
right? And
I think she has a goal, and that goal guides what she wants to get out of the biblical texts. And I simply ask different questions and have different goals and different information and ideas that I want to get to through the biblical text. So I think it's great that people engage with the Bible. And if you're willing to listen to a guy like me, then you're open and minded enough that, I think you're on the right track.
I think so too. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.